Please welcome Atlantic Live President Margaret Lowe.
Good morning. Good morning. As you just heard, I am Margaret Lowe, and I'm president of Atlantic Live, and I'm so happy to welcome you all this morning to our third annual Race and Justice Summit. We launched this undertaking 2 years ago in Washington, D.C., when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an Atlantic cover story called "The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration." And then last year, we were in Los Angeles to explore justice, access, and equity in the country's demographic bellwether. And now we're delighted to be here with all of you in Charlotte. So you might ask this morning, why did we choose to come here this year? Some facts on the ground, familiar to most or all of you, but worth repeating. Charlotte is one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Last year, 109 people moved into this town every single day, nearly 40,000 people in 1 year. The city's economy is bursting with possibility and accounts for nearly a third of the state's economic activity. But like so many American cities, not all of Charlotte's residents have experienced the fruits of this success. In fact, quite the opposite. 2 years ago, a group of researchers from Harvard and Stanford ranked the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area dead last in terms of upward mobility, meaning that low-income kids growing up in Charlotte, many of them kids of color, have a near impossible climb to make it out of poverty. The finding struck a nerve. And then, a little over a year ago, Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed by a police officer here, adding to an already long list of police shootings of black men across the country. People took to the streets of Charlotte for days afterward to protest the treatment of people of color at the hands of law enforcement. And in the year since the protest, there's been a great deal of soul-searching and conversation about what it would take to create a more equitable Charlotte. And that will be the focus of our conversation today. We will begin this morning zooming in on one piece of that story, the criminal justice system, where 3 out of 4 people in the local jail are African American or Hispanic, though these groups make up just a third of the local population. Today, and this conversation we're about to have would not be possible without the support of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and Bank of America. We are very, very grateful for that support. And with that, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Andrew Plepler, the bank's Global Head of Environmental, Social, and Governance, to share a few thoughts. Andrew.
Thank you, Margaret. You get cheered when you're the underwriter, so we appreciate that. We at Bank of America, we don't always get cheers, so we're very grateful for that. It is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to underwrite this conversation. I'm a little nervous. My rabbi's in the audience, Rabbi Judy Schindler. So when we have our leader of faith in the audience, we have to be on our game because you can't screw up when your faith leader is in the house. This is a really important conversation to have in Charlotte, as we know. People ask, why would Bank of America be associated with this conversation? The answer is actually pretty simple. We all have a stake in more civil discourse in our country, now more than ever, in solving what have been intractable problems for years. And if we don't do that, we are looking at a very challenging future in our communities, and very challenging places to do business, and very challenging places for our employees to live. And so we have a stake in the outcome of this conversation, and we need to participate in it. And the role of the private sector in helping to address some of these challenges and being 50th out of 50 in economic mobility is essential to the success of our company and essential to who we are as a corporate citizen. And if we don't seriously engage in this conversation in a way that goes beyond what we've done historically. It's one thing to sit and have a conversation one morning. It's another thing to actually roll up your sleeves and solve some of these problems over the long term. And that's what we're going to need to do. We're going to need to be at this work. This did not happen overnight. It won't get solved overnight. and we need to have some patience to get resolution. And that's our commitment as a company. We look forward to partnering with some of the great leaders in this room. And coming out of today, the real test will be whether we sustain the momentum of the conversation that started here this morning. And that is imperative to the success of this community and success of the country at large. So we look forward to being your partner. We're thrilled to be here with the MacArthur Foundation, the Casey Foundation, the Atlantic, who are truly wonderful partners and great thought leaders. And we know that some great ideas will come out of today's conversation. So thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Andrew Plepler, Bank of America. And now from the high-minded to the totally practical before we get rolling this morning. Please silence your cell phones. But do keep them close because we are on Twitter, of course, at Atlantic Live. The hashtag is Race+Justice, CLT, no spaces. And we'd actually love you to be part of the conversation in the room, too. We're going to have time for your questions throughout the morning, so don't be shy. And now to kick us off with a conversation on confronting history, monuments, and the Confederacy. For that, please welcome Bree Newsom, a Charlotte-based activist and artist who made her name when she removed the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House in 2015. Welcome, Bree. And she's here with my colleague, Atlantic staff writer Van Newkirk. Van, take it away.
Well, thank you, thank you. As a person who was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be able to be here to speak with Bree Newsom, who's been doing work in this community about symbols, history, and this legacy of white supremacy that people are still grappling with today. So why don't we get started? Can you just tell us more, Bree, about the work that you are doing in Charlotte and how people are responding to it and sort of what are your big ticket items you're working with now?
Yeah, certainly. So I am a local community organizer here. One of the main issues that I'm trying to help organize around right now is the issue of housing justice, which is really, I would argue, at the intersection of so many other issues. So obviously policing has been at the forefront. You know, it was just mentioned how Charlotte has an issue, obviously, to put it lightly, of economic mobility, upward economic mobility. But one of the things that we know is that access to safe, stable, affordable housing is one of the most key ways that people are able to come out of poverty. It has been shown in other cities that if they're trying to end homelessness, you know, sometimes people think, well, if we can first get people a job, then maybe they can get money. But what studies have shown is that securing housing is really the first basic need. So, and I mean, our ability to live in safe neighborhoods is also connected to policing, and so many of these are schools as well. You know, what neighborhood you live in determines what school you go to. Where I live over in West Charlotte, you know, if you were to look at a school over there and then compare it to a public school in South Charlotte, you might not think that they were in the same school system. So
it seems like you're in the center of this tangled knot of different things you're trying to pull apart. Where do they join? What makes housing related to policing, and how did you see that play out over the last year?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the basic issue, again, it comes down to racism and economic justice. And even those two issues you can't really untangle, because economic inequality, as people of color know, is directly tied to racism. Racism impacts our ability to get home loans. Racism impacts our interactions with police in our community. So there really is no separation. When the uprising happened last year, that was a straw breaking the camel's back moment. It was in direct response to the killing of Keith Lamont Scott, but it's really in response to a condition, and that's true of any of the uprisings that we've seen, whether it's in Ferguson or in Baltimore. This is coming after, you know, a series of police killings here. We had the Jonathan Farrell case. We had Letitia Fonville, who was killed in her home. We had Larico Williams, who was tasered to death when he was unarmed. On top of the squeeze around housing, not being able to have access to affordable housing, the cost of housing going up while wages are stagnant, all of these things contribute to a condition, and eventually the community that has, you know, protested and petitioned for so long reaches a breaking point.
So why Charlotte? Why do you think the uprising happened here, protests here, when I think the other places where they happen, Baltimore, you look at St. Louis, they've traditionally been seen as places that have always struggled with race and racism. But Charlotte doesn't really have that reputation historically. So what is the underlying thing about Charlotte? Well, number one, why are we here talking about Charlotte?
Yeah, well, I think the key thing in what you just said was reputation and seen as, right? So how the reputation and how something is perceived is not necessarily the same as reality. I have visited both St. Louis and Baltimore. I think one of the differences there is that some of the conditions are more in your face, particularly in Baltimore. You know, if you were to walk from where Freddie Gray was killed to the Inner Harbor, it's not that far. I went up there and marched during the protests there. And so it's really in your face. In Charlotte, we're a little bit more geographically spread out, and it's possible to be in Charlotte. You can live in one area of Charlotte and be completely oblivious to the other part, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I mean, we absolutely have our own history of segregation. We absolutely have our own history of urban renewal. You know, we had prosperous Black neighborhoods like Brooklyn that were pretty much wiped out. During the uprising, there were several different points where protesters marched up 277 and blocked the street. And that wasn't just to stop traffic, that's also in protest of roadways that were literally run through Black neighborhoods and pretty much destroyed them. So yes, and I mean, I think that's true not just of Charlotte, but of North Carolina. There's kind of this perception that, you know, we are the more progressive, you know, part of the South. We are the new South, right? I think there's some truth to that. We have a lot of diversity. We have a lot of people who are relocating here, and we're finding our identity in some ways. But the old South is still very much there. The new South is something that we have to define what that looks like, but we don't get there without confronting the truth of our past.
So why now, do you think? Why the past 2 years are we seeing sort of the facade of the New South, especially in what might be its capital, Charlotte? It's crumbling a bit, and there seems to be a long arc of history between what you're mentioning, the placement of highways through communities, the segregation, the reverse segregation and white flight. Those seem to have all come to a head this year and last year. What do you think is the animating spirit there?
I think there's a combination of factors that are going on. So I think economically, you know, we are not separate from the rest of the nation. We had a major housing crash in 2009. And though there are certain sectors and certain segments of the population that bounce back from that, the reality is that African Americans lost about 3/4 of our wealth in that collapse. So, and we haven't really recovered from that. So I think you have a confluence of conditions going on in the mix with the election of the nation's first Black president, which happened in 2008. North Carolina voted for a Democratic president for the first time since the Civil Rights Movement. That was a major seismic shift, and it was around that time, around 2013, that I first really got involved in activism, and one of the first things I was protesting over was the attack on voting rights in our state. So what we have seen is some kind of like steady progress that has happened since the Civil Rights Movement, and also backlash. Both of those things have been going on. It hasn't only moved in one direction. So just as, you know, CMS was being credited in a lot of ways for its busing program and really achieving equality, there was also counteraction to that. It was never just moving in one direction.
Yeah, that counteraction, I think another part of that Charlotte being the New South thing is, as a kid, I never saw the Confederate flag or those type of symbols in polite spaces, right? But you notice now with counter-protesters, you see, I think, a lot more of the flag. You see people sort of, the alt-right creeping in, even in Charlotte. What do you think the role is of these symbols in sort of promoting maybe a little bit of that backlash against Obama? Where do they come from and why?
Well, I think it has the same meaning today that it did in 1960, right? So the Confederate flag is not something that was prevalent throughout the South immediately following the Civil War. It's something that came back into popular usage, and you can trace the popularity of kind of like the ebb and flow around the popularity of Confederate symbols corresponds to the ebb and flow of civil rights movement. So a lot of the Confederate monuments that people are protesting now were first erected like in the 1920s, you know, when lynching was at its peak. A lot of the Confederate flags that were raised, including the one in South Carolina that I removed, was raised in like 1961. They were raised in the 60s as statements of opposition to the civil rights movement. And the resurgence in popularity today is also in response to modern civil rights and black liberation movements. I mean, there was not, I promise you, when we removed the Confederate flag, you saw Confederate flags in places that you hadn't seen them before they started appearing, you know, all over the place. And they mean the same thing today that they did back then. Back then it was, you know, we don't support Martin Luther King, we don't support civil rights. Today it's, you know, we don't support Black Lives Matter, we don't support Colin Kaepernick, we don't support racial equality. Same difference.
So it's been 2 years since you took the flag down? 2 years.
Yes.
What's your life been like for the past 2 years? As a person who now is known for protesting that flag, do you feel compelled to speak out about its prominence, its resurgence, and just the role of symbols now?
Yes and no. So I think to a certain extent, yes, I think it's pretty known how I feel about Confederate symbology, particularly on public property and on state property, as it was the case in South Carolina. The main thing that's changed for me is I've just been given more of a platform. Like, you know, a movement to remove Confederate symbology was never a focus for me before the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, at which point I felt it was important to make that statement. But I think that the ongoing movements to remove Confederate flags and monuments and everything like that, it's mostly local movements, which is kind of how I feel it should be. I mean, in Charlottesville, I know a lot of the organizers there. They worked for a long time. They lobbied, they, you know, organized their community members, and they eventually got the city to agree to remove the Confederate monument. Of course, then they became a national target. But, you know, I think for the most part, that's kind of how it should go. I'm not necessarily trying to parachute in everywhere and you know, remove symbols. Though I sometimes still get people contacting me, they're like, Bree, I just saw a Confederate flag on the highway, what should I do? And I'm like, well, you know, you might want to consult a lawyer first before you do anything. I did that, I recommend doing that. But even beyond that, you know, so I think symbols, monuments, these are very important. They represent an ideology, right? But we could remove all the Confederate monuments. That doesn't mean that we can then pat ourselves on the back and be like, okay, slavery's over, racism's over, we've solved everything because we removed the monuments. So as much as I argue for removing them, I'm constantly pushing people beyond that. That's just the start. We have to address policy, we have to address social practice. It's not enough to just take down a monument.
Yeah, it seems like post-Charlottesville, especially, the conversation has been symbols, 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 flags, statues, Confederate memorials. Do you think now, I mean, even among good sort of people who you are working with, well-meaning folks, their stance one way or the other on the flag might be obscuring sort of the actual ongoing work underneath that?
To a certain extent. Like, I don't think there is a day in America where we have achieved racial justice and equality and we have monuments to Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis up around the nation. So I think that's a necessary step in things coming down. But like I said, we have to constantly push for the deeper work to be done. What happened in the past years, which is great, is that we went from a point where there was a refusal to even lower the Confederate flag in South Carolina to half staff as they were burying an assassinated black representative, right, who was just killed by a white supremacist in a historically black church. We've gone from there to, you know, the governor of Louisiana quickly taking down statues. So that shows a change, a shifting in the thinking of the mainstream. And so it's great that people are now, many municipalities across the country are embracing this idea of removing the Confederate symbology. However, right, where we have to be careful is it can be very easy to be like, oh, again, you know, our city, we've had this big ceremony, we've removed the monument, and now we can keep going. And my question is like, no, now we need to talk about why are black people in your city disproportionately poor? Why are the black children in your city disproportionately at underperforming schools? Those are the deeper conversations that we have to have. And that's the way it is with all movement. Like, it's great, you reach a certain point where certain things that you're pushing for kind of move into the mainstream, that's great. But as an activist, we have to keep pushing.
But what's it say to you when so many of these movements to get rid of flags, to think about and challenge people's understanding of symbols, that's met with so much resistance and violence in some cases? What does that say for doing the sort of more difficult work when that very surface symbolic thing is so difficult?
Well, I think that speaks to how deep it is, right? That's how deeply ingrained it is that and that was one of my frustrations even in 2015. Here we had an instance where this young white man from Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of South Carolina, went down to Charleston, shot several black people in a historically black church. And the focus in the following days was not, let's pause and examine what are all the conditions that led to this situation. The focus was on the Confederate flag and why we can't lower the Confederate flag even to half-staff because of these laws that have been passed, right? So the fact that the monuments, the Confederate monuments still get more weight and importance and energy than Black lives. You know, in Charlottesville, I mean, even with Heather Heyer, who was, you know, a young white woman who was killed there, they're still more focused on the Robert E. Lee statue than on her life or examining the person who ran her over. We're still more focused on pieces of metal and pieces of fabric than human life. That's what we should be talking about.
So when we started planning this, I think what was on our minds was Keith Lamont Scott. What was the uprising, was a protest, and the disturbances and the police response over the past year. But now we have Ruben Galindo. Why has there not been sort of the same outrage from your perspective of what people in Charlotte are going through? Is there a fatigue or people just sort of thinking of different ways? What's going on there?
I don't know. I don't know that you can't say that there's not the same level of outrage. I think that the tensions in every city and within this nation kind of ebb and flow. I mean, just in St. Louis, I mean, they had just had another uprising of sorts. It's not on the same level that, you know, that Ferguson was in 2014. But it hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped the protest. I think, again, you know, some other conditions that I think are important to keep in mind around the time of Keith Lamont Scott. We also had, and forgive me, I can't call the name. I think Philando Castile had just happened around that time, and oh goodness, the black man who was shot getting out of his car, had his hands up, was shot by a white female police officer. And I'm sorry, I can't call his name right now. But those cases had just happened as well. So there was already a tension that had been building when Keith Lamont Scott happened. So I don't think that people are less outraged. I think that there are just certain moments and kind of a combination of factors that can trigger that kind of response. Because an uprising is not a planned protest. This is not where people get together and say, okay, we're going to march in the streets. This is an immediate emotional response that a community is showing at having reached a breaking point.
I'm going to open up the floor for questions in 1 minute, so everybody get your questions together. But a follow-up to that question, it does seem, you know, when you have continued sort of police shootings, when you have these concerns that people don't feel are adequately addressed by the people in power, is there no sort of sense of, okay, maybe this might be, maybe there's fatigue, maybe people are, they think that nothing's going to come of something. So how do people sort of motivate themselves to do the work of racial justice?
There's possibly some of that. I think as an organizer, I think uprisings happen when there's less organization, right? So we reach a point of an uprising when we are not organized to the point of one, preventing it from happening in the first place, and two, from having an organized response when it happens. Part of what we have seen with the Ruben Galindo cases, there's been an organized response. So there, you know, we haven't at least yet reached another point of having an uprising. But a lot of times what happens is that the cameras particularly don't show up. Like cameras tend to not show up unless there's violence, unless there's disruption, unless there's a window broken. Right? They don't even show up when somebody dies, but they'll show up if the window is broken and they can flash the camera on it. But when we are organized, it doesn't look like that. Being organized doesn't look like we have to go uptown and smash a window in order for folks to show up and we get a response. Being organized looks like we have a petition already signed, we have a response all ready to go, we're showing up at city council, we're demanding these things, we're challenging laws that were put in place following Keith Lamont Scott, where now we have to go through court to request video. Part of why we have the video of Ruben Galindo is because organizations work together to press the court on getting that video released, since there was a law that had been passed since Keith Lamont Scott requiring us to go to court in order to get access to body camera footage.
Yeah, that's what I was going to note is the reason why we know so much about it is sort of the things put in place over the past year, the laws, the rules of accountability for police.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, let's open up for questions. Come on, somebody has a good question. Just a diaphragm. Yeah, I can hear you.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we address, from a grassroots perspective, getting people trained into the workforce and compete?
Yes, well, again, I think it's a both and, because the issue isn't simply that people need training or that people need access to jobs. The part of the issue is that we are confronting a system that doesn't provide jobs for people. That system is rooted in slavery, which was about free labor. And I think you're completely right. I mean, part of the issue that we have been dealing with since emancipation is the resistance to a free, empowered, economically and politically empowered Black population. I mean, that's what the basic pushback is. So we have people who they have jobs in prison that they can't get on the outside. They get trained on things that they can do in prison that they don't get access to those jobs outside. So it has to be a both and. On one, and you were asking practically and tactically. That's one of the things that we try to do, is to have community skill sharing. There's a lot of organizing and building that we have to do outside of existing institutions, because institutionally things are set up to maintain a racial caste. So, you know, having skills training, job training, and at the same time pushing against the system that's not hiring people, whether they are trained or not. Even if you can get a job and you're not being paid enough, you're not being paid a living wage, so you still can't afford to live in the city, doesn't do us any good. So we have to push for both of those things at the same time. And I would argue that economic justice is racial justice. I don't think you can separate those two things.
All right.
Brilliant discussion. I wanted to ask you, in the world of activism, there is a supposed tension between millennial activists and older activists. What are some things you think each generation can teach each other, and what do you think is a path forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some truth to that, and to a certain extent, I feel like it's a little overblown sometimes, because I think that has existed forever. I don't think that's just something that's between millennials and you know, older generations. I think that's something that people who are involved with SNCC, you know, they would sometimes bump heads with people from SCLC. So I don't think that's anything new. I think that young people are more eager a lot of times, sometimes more optimistic, sometimes, you know, more aggressive in terms of pushing for change. I think one of the things that has happened with this more modern movement is it has mostly been young people being killed by police. So in this confrontation against police brutality in particular, and like when I first got involved in movement work in 2013, that was one of the major issues, was that young people were wanting to push this issue of police brutality to the forefront. And some of the like older folks within the movement didn't want to go there. They wanted to talk about some other things. And we were like, you really can't look away. In terms of what we can learn from each other, I think there's a lot to be learned from what has already happened in the past. There are a lot of things we think we might be doing that are new. It's not new at all. I think really understanding a lot of the strategy that went into some of the tactics that were employed in the past. Like for instance, we might do a sit-in, you know, and be modeling, you know, a sit-in from the 60s. But, you know, I think it's important to understand the strategy that went into doing that. But I also think it's important to listen to young people. There are some things that young people are dealing with now that are new. The school to prison pipeline. young people being forced out of school systematically and into prisons, this interaction with the police. I mean, that's something that has always existed, but I think it is on another level now. I think that cameras have just kind of brought it to the forefront, the amount of young people who are, losing their lives to the criminal justice system one way or the other. I think that covers Trayvon Martin. I think that covers Khalif Browder, Jonathan Ferrell. I think it covers with all of them. One way or the other, they are being killed by this system.
Well, I want to say thank you for your questions, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
For a look at race and justice in Mecklenburg County, please welcome Marcus Kirkman, a life and wellness coach who works with at-risk youth and their families. Robin Withrow, a county assistant district attorney. Robert Dawkins, the state organizer for Safe Coalition NC. Kevin Tully, the county's public defender. And Chief District Judge Reagan Miller. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome Atlantic Senior Editor Ron Brownstein.
Thank you. I always like being the last one to come on stage because I know that the right place to sit is where I am not on anyone's lap. So it makes it a lot easier. Like a lot of cities, Charlotte is grappling with a series of intertwined issues about the level of incarceration, the level of crime, the relations between the police and communities, particularly the African American community, and the level of opportunity in a place that is growing and adding jobs, ensuring that those opportunities are available to all of the communities in the area. So let me start with a question. And when you think about those intertwined set of challenges, which seems to you today the most urgent in Charlotte, and how do they intersect? Kevin, maybe you could start us off?
Well, obviously, my viewpoints are colored by the work that I do. I've been a criminal defense lawyer, specifically a public defender, since 1989. So the most pressing to me is, at first, and it's starting already to happen, an awakening and an acknowledgement that we do have racial disparities in outcomes. We do have policies which have racial impacts directly. And that is step one, to at least acknowledge it. Your community leaders in the criminal court system have at least gotten that far. They're willing to say they're not happy with it. Where we go from here is, what do you do about it?
Judge?
Well, when I was in law school, one of the cases that we studied early on with respect to discrimination, employment discrimination, things like that, was the case right from here in Charlotte, Griggs versus Duke Power. And the legal concept that was created by that case was one about disparate impact. Facially neutral policies that have a disparate impact on certain segments of the community. So one of the things that we've been looking at from the bench is whether policies that we have been following for years. I mean, when I came on the bench, there were certain things that you were expected to do. For instance, setting bonds. Well, this particular offense has this bond associated to it at a minimum. And so what we've begun looking at is that seems pretty simple and facially neutral as far as race or ethnicity or anything like that. But what is the actual what's the actual consequence of implementing that with respect to various segments of our community? So we are really taking a very close look as part of the system here on whether what we're doing is having an impact on certain segments of the community.
So, sorry, Robert. Yeah, then go to Robin. Yeah.
Ladies first. We're in
Okay,
Charlotte.
go ahead.
I think about the way things are different now. I'm at the district attorney's office, and I joined the office about 11 years ago, and prior to that, I was a criminal defense attorney as well. And I was anticipating this panel today, and as I was thinking about it last night, I realized that 11 years ago, when I joined the office, the concept of implicit bias was not anything I had really heard of. It's really something that has come about in the last several years, and how important that is, particularly in the criminal justice system and as it relates to each of our agencies that make up the criminal justice system. The district attorney's office takes that concept to heart and is very concerned about the concept of implicit bias, and we've done a lot of training around that. We've brought folks into our office. John Powell came and did an implicit bias training for all of our attorneys. We have to protect ourselves against the thing that we don't even realize we're engaging in, right? It's what we don't know that is probably the scariest thing. And so one of the other things that was very important in our office was to insulate cases that Kevin's attorneys may be defending against from any single one person's implicit bias. So we engaged in a process of roundtabling all of our cases so that you bring a group of people to do a formal analysis of a case before it moves along in the system. I think the recognition of implicit bias.
And now, just stop you there. Explain a little bit that process. So when you say you bring a group of people together to decide what charge to bring or whether to bring the charge?
Well, the charge has already been brought
Right.
by law enforcement. Our attorneys get together in the teams. We have several different teams based around subject matter expertise, if you will. And they come together as a group. Anywhere from 5 to 12 or more attorneys will sit around and analyze a drug case or a crimes against persons case or a property case and make the determination which direction does this case need to go. And we look at what's going on with the defendant, the value of the case, if you will. What's their prior record? What circumstances do they find themselves in that may have contributed to this act, to this potential criminal act? So that's the type of practice we go through to make sure we don't have a single implicit bias issue that's at play.
Robert, how do these pieces fit together in your mind?
So when we sit here and we look at Charlotte, I mean, just no holds barred, being honest, we study stuff to death. We talk about every few years we come back and we get right back where we were again. Oh my God, that's a problem. Let's study it. You know, and for people that work in the community and we knock doors, it's been led for most of the people in the community losing faith in the system. You know, everybody now sits here and said that there's this report that came out from Berkeley and Harvard that said Charlotte is 50th in
Upward mobility.
Upward mobility. But how did that surprise you? We started doing quality of life studies every year since 1992. If you couldn't look at the data and say, oh, this might be a problem. It's only a problem when people from the outside say, Charlotte, you have a problem. And that's when people decide, oh my God, we got to get busy. You can't sit back and say that we have a problem with upward mobility when education's problems started when we got rid of Swan versus Board of Education. So that started then, and you let it go for 20 years, and then you say, oh my God, we have a problem with education. We knew when we built Charlotte that we were building jobs. My wife, luckily, works for Wells Fargo, was Bank of America, but that's something. You get downsized in Charlotte quick. So hopefully you rotate through the banks, Bank of America, then Wells Fargo, then BB&T, but you get to work. But the point is, my wife had the ability to do that. When I first moved to Charlotte in 1996, you could go up and down the North Tryon corridor and you could find jobs that other people worked at. Those jobs don't exist anymore. So now we sit back again 20 years later and said, well, how come people can't afford these jobs? Well, you only made jobs for MBAs. And now you want to know why the people in the neighborhoods are upset.
And that's, Mark, we were talking about this. You work with young people, many who have interacted with the criminal justice system. This is a city that, according to the Brookings Institution, ranks in the top 15 of all the 100 largest metros in job creation since 2010. Ranks, I think, 14th in total increase in the economic output of the region since 2010. Added 100,000 people in the last 5 years, many of them brought in from around the country. How relevant is any of that growth to the kids you work with? Do they see it as something they can access and benefit from, or is it happening somewhere else?
Okay, so the children that I get a chance to work with and the families, all of our children are referred to as to the juvenile court system. So they have a record of some sort, maybe a small crime, in some cases felonies. With these children, it's difficult for them to make the connection to what's happening in Charlotte. They grew up in this city, they know this city, this is their home. But what they've experienced in the juvenile court system and their socioeconomic status with their families, they can't make that connection. One thing that I like to share with regards to implicit bias and how we arrived at this point, how is Charlotte talking about race and justice and Lamont Scott shooting? It starts with the individual. The analogy I like to use is we're under the influence of something. What is that? What is that influence? Anytime we come to a situation and we interact with another individual, we're bringing our own individual issues to that situation. And if we have not checked ourselves, if we're not in balance, just like in a car accident when somebody's under the influence of alcohol or drugs, that's going to be a major problem. And in some cases, you can leave someone completely destroyed. So with these children who've experienced with the juvenile court system issues, we come in and we salvage the situation. We want to help put their lives back together and paint that picture to say, this is your city. And you don't have to be ashamed of the mistakes you made. It's going to be all right. We'll put you back together.
Yeah. Let's now talk about each of these different areas individually, starting with incarceration. The community has received the grant from MacArthur. They've made a commitment to reduce the jail population, I think, by 13% over the next 2 years. Now, over the last couple years, that had been declining, but since early 2016, it has been going back up. And in fact, since early 2016, it's about 20% higher than it was then. What's the larger trend? I mean, are you seeing a reduction in your population in the jail? Is this a blip? And what will it take to meet the kind of goals of reduction that you have set out? Kevin, can you start us, maybe?
Yeah, and I want to back up and say, as the public defender, you're a public defender in Mecklenburg County, I don't consider myself a part of this system. And I don't call it the criminal justice system. I call it the criminal court system. It hasn't earned the right to be called the justice system yet. That being said, we do have some good people in that system, and where I can, I do look to collaborate with them on efforts to improve. There comes a time where collaboration isn't enough and talking needs to end and action needs to be taken. That is sometimes the role of the defense. We need to litigate some of these issues. If people aren't willing to move beyond talking, then we need to go into court and litigate and get action, enforced action. But to get to your point about the jail, we have a realization and awakening that we have so many people in jail, not because they're charged with a crime, but because they're poor. I've had judges, when I've been in court recently making this argument, say to me, no, Mr. Tully, your client is in jail because he got charged with those 4 crimes. And I said, yes, but a person who's charged with those same 4 crimes is sitting at home on his couch right now because he had the money to go home. Right? And this the money bail system has nothing to do, and the public needs to understand it and tell your elected officials that you understand it does nothing to keep you safe. All it does is keep poor people in jail and let dangerous people who have money out. So we have made some progress. We will continue to make progress as long as these evidence-based practices are followed. There has been an uptick in crime, particularly I think in some violent crime. I do think the community needs to ask itself the causes of that crime. The criminal justice system is really a reactionary system. That crime has already happened by the time we deal with it. We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing once that person comes in? Are we doing more harm and making matters worse before that person re-enters your community? But the community really needs to ask itself, what are the conditions in our community in housing, in education, in employment that are driving some of that crime? And then we'll see greater reductions.
Robin, can I ask you?
Sure. I don't know the correlation, if you will, between the uptick in our jail and the uptick in crime. I think that's yet to be determined. So it's important to know or recognize what we don't know. To Kevin's point, it is offensive to me as a prosecutor that there are folks in jail simply because they couldn't afford to get out. It is equally offensive to me that a dangerous, wealthy person can be out walking our streets. That's a problem. And that's what we are trying to address with the Safety and Justice Challenge. Some of our strategies, like our failure to comply, folks who fail to comply, say with a money judgment or with a court cost or fee or fine or something like that, historically, if they fail to comply, an order for arrest is issued for them, and they get right back into the system that they couldn't afford to engage in the first place. And so we're working with those types of strategies to recognize that when you have someone who couldn't afford it in the first place, let's not put them back in the system to make sure they can't afford it a second time. So those are the types of strategies we're working on. We're also working on case processing, and within the case processing arena, working on a program that we have here in Charlotte called Fast Track. It is where someone who is in custody because they couldn't afford to get out and perhaps were not dangerous, and they have a plea offer from the district attorney's office, and that plea offer contemplates probation or something less than incarceration. We try to get those cases on more quickly so that those folks can be taken care of and get out of the jail, right? Get out and perhaps go back to their families, their lives, and hopefully some opportunities. To talk about the upward mobility issue, and Kevin brought it up with housing and education, look, it's not lost on me, and I hope any prosecutor in our office, that the decisions that we make every single day affect people's lives. And it doesn't just affect whether they're in jail or whether they're at home or whether they're going to be on probation, but it affects whether they're going to be able to go to school or get a job or get housing and have those types of opportunities. One of the things that we've engaged in is working with community advocates in the expunction clinics. And it's not that I'm there as a prosecutor giving advice to people who want to get their cases expunged, but I'm there simply to accept service of their expunction paperwork, to move their process along and make it easier for them. And we found that very favorable.
So Judge, to Kevin's point, I mean, I think a lot of communities are grappling with the issue of how do you tie pretrial incarceration to risk, not to financial vulnerability? How do you ensure that people, I think 2/3 of your people in the jail are in a pretrial situation. Yeah. How do you ensure that the ones who are there are the ones who are a potential risk to the community, not just those who can't afford to get out? What are the barriers to getting to that? It seems to make sense from a lot of different perspectives. What are the big obstacles to getting there?
Well, you know, there's no barrier to it right now. In fact, Mecklenburg County has adopted the use of a risk assessment tool that we obtained from the Arnold Foundation, and it makes an assessment of each individual as far as what their risk of once the charge is filed, what's their risk of getting into more trouble if we let them out of jail? And secondly, what's their risk of not showing up for court? And it's pretty objective, you know, in its use. It's also been adjusted to take into account things like poverty and things of that nature. And so we've done this, and yes, we when we implemented it and made it part of our pretrial release policy, we were well over 2,500 people in jail on any given day. Right. We dropped that down to 1,300 at one point. Right. And then we were told the crime rate's gone up. And so we ticked back up to about 1,700,
Right.
which is where we are now. But the judges are using the tool, and we're trying our best, you know, it's just a tool, because other things happen. I'm the only elected official up here right now.
Yeah.
No voter has come to me and said, you need to let more people out of jail. That's not associated with the court system. You know, and so as an elected official, we respond to that. We have community groups that come and sit in our courtroom, and they're listening to the way we set bonds or conditions of release. And they're there to tell me that a 16-year-old who got suspended from school and was home all day and started breaking into people's homes, allegedly. Thank you. You're welcome. Needs to go to jail right away, needs to stay in jail. And we have to remind them that under our system of justice, a person charged with a crime is innocent until proven guilty. And that maybe that kid needs to be sent home with certain things put in place where he gets better supervision. He's told that he has to go to school every day, and we're going to monitor that. And all of these things need to take place. But you know, the simple answer is if you're charged with breaking and entering, your bond, no matter what your age is, no matter what your financial status is, should be this amount of money that you have to come up with. Well, 16-year-old is not going to come up with $500. The parents are going to come up with that. And I can't tell on any given day, because we're not treating these as juveniles until 2019. On any given day, a kid that's standing in front of me, that his parents have the ability to come up with $500 to get him out of jail. So, but that's the way, that's the system we have right now. That's how we do things. And it needs to be changed, and I should say this. We have a meeting once a month with the key court officials, as we call ourselves. The public defender, the district attorney, our elected clerk of court, and the sheriff actually comes to our meetings now, and the senior resident superior court judge, and of course the most important person in the group, me. And we talk about these issues. You know, I get a daily report on what our jail population is. I get the statistics on the breakdown of race, charges, and all those things. And I'm sitting there examining that and trying to figure out what's going on here. I haven't come up with an answer, Robert.
I agree with pretty much everything that Judge Miller said except for one point, and that's if you're a judge, I get that you're a politician, but your decisions on doing stuff shouldn't be tied to calls from the people, because judges, even though they're elected, are umpires and not elected officials, and shouldn't be influenced by people's calls. But secondly, on the risk part, the issue that I have with even the risk assessment, I waited my whole life to be on a grand jury because I'm an activist. I was like, yes, I want to be on a grand jury. It took me to 48 years old for finally to get the letter. So I went down there, and the judge said, I want to hear from anybody that can't be on the jury. I was the only one that didn't raise my hand because I wanted to be on it, because I wanted to see the process. And what I saw when I got there to be in the process is how unfair the charging is of people, especially poor people. And that, I don't know how that figures into the risk assessment. So I go in the store and I steal one candy bar. So it should be one charge for stealing a candy bar. But when it comes to us to do the grand jury, that one candy bar is 4 charges. I got the charge for stealing the candy bar. I got a charge for stealing the candy bar in the school zone. I got a charge for stealing the candy bar after 5 o'clock. And I got another charge. So now, instead of just one charge, we at the grand jury got 4 charges on one person. And that goes, how does that figure into the risk assessment? Because now the person looks and says, this person's got to be horrible. He's been charged with 16 different crimes, but he only did 2 things.
Go ahead.
The risk assessment, and you know, I'm not all in on our particular one, but what it has done has changed the judge's focus. And what is supposed to be happening in that situation is the judge is not to look at the fact that there are 4 charges, but to look at the person and evaluate the risk of that person to the community. And we are making some progress in that. I want to highlight one thing, because our jail population did cut in about half. We were at 2,700, got down to about 1,300. This community was getting ready to build a $580 million new jail because the jails were at capacity. But because some of these things have taken place, the jails got down to about half full that we have. That happened 3 years ago. Our crime rate during that 3 years went down. So I don't want anybody walking away with the impression that the efforts that were made to bring the jail population down caused some rise in crime. It did not. And that is why I think the MacArthur Foundation was very intentional in naming their challenge the Safety and Justice Challenge. It is about doing things better without making our community at risk.
Mark, you see this from the other perspective, from the point of view of families who may be dealing with an incarcerated member, either a child or a parent. What is and when we talk about the fact that 2/3 of the people in the jail are simply just waiting, they have not been convicted, they're in a pretrial situation, what is the impact on families of that kind of pattern?
Well, I don't know if this mic is on. Typically, I don't need a mic.
Yes, I think the mic's on.
Okay. Okay, so let's put this in perspective. We're saying 2/3 of the population are pretrial just sitting there. Okay, if this is the population of youth that we deal with, we're talking under the age of 18 years old. That's a teenager that's sitting there. That teenager is sitting there basically within their soul, they are dying. They're sitting in an adult situation trying to process it as a child. I was in the military for 22 years, a retired senior chief. I had a conversation with our youth week before last and used the analogy of this. If you put a backpack on your back, because most kids like to carry a backpack, got all the shoes and electronics and all that good stuff in there. Let's say that backpack weighed 15 pounds. For a teenager, that's fine to carry. But I asked them to try to put that backpack on an infant, and what would it do? When these children or people in general are sitting there in incarceration with their lives on hold, they are carrying a weight they're not built to carry. And how do you rebound from that? So now the entire family is impacted by this. If it's the young child, let's say it's the only child, only son. For most cases, he is that security in the home, even at 17, 18, 16, 17 years old. Now his entire family is vulnerable. The impact that it has on children and anybody who's incarcerated sitting there that long, when they get back out, we live in a throwaway society. People will just throw you away if you make one mistake. We're not in that place of compassion where I would like to see us become, where we would start the healing process and look at people as individuals and humans opposed to mistakes that they made.
Oh, thank you. Let's go to the audience for a couple questions. And I see one right in the middle here. There you go, standing up.
My name is Alma Moore. I'm program coordinator for Dash Mentoring. That's my right-hand markers for Mecklenburg County. Something that's missing in this piece is the issue of mental illness.
Yeah.
When did jails become repositories for mentally ill people?
Right.
That's a result of depression, anxiety, from being poor, as Bree said. It's a systematic thing. So if you're worried about how you're going to have lights on, if you're homeless, the families that Marcus and I deal with have all kinds of issues. The one-year mentoring program, just mentor some kids and find some mentors. Yep. Gee, the family situations that we have, it's households of mentally ill people, and these kids are trying to survive. They're good kids. Just last week, we went to court, Marcus' connection with Colonel Williams at Tar Heel Challenge. This young man was a victim of his mother's choice of men in domestic violence, so the whole household needs therapy, and they're getting it now. The colonel and his deputy director came in the courtroom and says, we are accepting him the first time, y'all, in the history of a juvenile court situation. And the court counsel said, lock him up, go to the YDC. This child will go to Tar Heel on the 22nd. So it was like we were the demons for trying to give that child one more sense of hope. What do you all do to address mental illness?
There are a lot of communities where the sheriffs and the jail feel as though they're the mental health provider of last resort. Is that what you see here as well?
Well, mental illness is complicated. There are no simple answers to very complex issues. So first of all, a policeman encounters someone who has someone's alleged has committed a crime. Now, I don't think that our police officers can make a mental health assessment when they come into contact with that individual. In fact, as enlightened as our sheriff is, and the programs that he has in his jail right now, there is no one on that front end, particularly with adults charged with crime, who is making an assessment of the mental health of a particular individual who's been charged with a crime. Now, the first time the court may hear about that is from one of the public defenders who's interviewed the person, who's gone and done a background study, who's asked questions about mental illness and hospitalizations and things like that. And so they make that initial assessment, but again, they are not experts in this area. And so with respect to someone who's charged with a crime, it's very hard for us to put into place resources that assist that person, doesn't harm the person as they are in the system.
Can I respond to that? I agree that there are no simple answers, but there is one simple answer, that the court system and the jail is not the place to deal with mental illness. Yep. Okay, and that is exactly what we're doing for some of the reasons that the judge just described. It does highlight the role of the defense, that we are the people who are in contact with the people who come into the system, and we can make them human, right? We hear about processing cases. These are not cases, these are people. And we have to remind the system to rehumanize. It's ridiculous that we have to say that, rehumanize the people who are coming through the system. So, but the court system does not have the resources to deal with it. We do raise it. There are people who will recognize it, but we don't have any resources to deal with it. I think the community needs to speak to your elected officials and say, that is absurd. We need to build the resources to deal with mental health in our community so it doesn't reach the jail.
Robert, I know you want to weigh in on this, but I want to add one thing to the mix as we have to cede the stage shortly to our next panelists. Policy at the jail and incarceration are only one element of the criminal justice picture in any community. The Keith Lamont Scott shooting, could you talk about what has changed in policing since then and what hasn't and should, and add anything you want to on this question of mental illness?
Sure. So first I'll do the mental illness part. I think that all police officers need to be having CIT training, which we've asked Charlotte Police to do. Still have not seen a report on it. We've been asking for it now for a year and a half. Ask them. For the sheriff's department and all, they shouldn't be experts in anything. But if you can devote as much time to finding a person's mental status as you do their immigration status, maybe that'll be a place to start. As far as what's changed since Keith Lamont Scott, not much, but there's been some light at the end of the tunnel. Hasn't been as much on the police department as it has been from our judicial system. One of the biggest things that we were requesting at SAFE and ACLU and all of us was better access and transparency to video. The police department itself has not fought the release of video since then. The judicial system has granted the release of all video that's been asked for since then. Those are pluses. The minuses is we had just dealt with some of the things that we saw during Keith Lamont Scott the year before. We passed what was called a Civil Liberties Resolution, which said how you're supposed to interact with protesters. That wasn't followed. We asked for less subjectivity in arrest. What are you arresting a person for? That wasn't followed. During the Keith Lamont Scott case, the judicial system again had to step in. The police department arrested people on all kinds of charges. One person was standing here and they got arrested for inciting a riot. The person beside him that did the same thing got charged with disturbing the peace. The arrests were so subjective that when it got to court, pretty much all of the cases got thrown out. So we do see a lot of passing things on paper, which has been the Charlotte model. We see you're upset, so we're going to pass this, but then they never implement it.
Marcus, I'm going to give you the final word.
Sure. I just wanted to speak to the mental health piece.
Yeah.
And I know it's a large piece, but it's a real piece. And it has its place. I'm 6'5", 300 pounds. What happens when I step out every day and I interact with law enforcement? I can tell you I lived it, and it's not pretty. When they look at me, I'm an immediate threat. They don't see the grandfather in me. They don't see the son in me. They don't see the husband in me, the friend. They don't see that. Immediately, they go for protection mode. If that's happening to me on a regular basis, what's happening to our young men on a regular basis? So with the mental health component, I completely agree. The city and the leadership, not just in Charlotte, we've got to take a round turn on humanity because we've disconnected from what humanity is. To look across and see a person as a person. Until we start doing that, we can continue to miss the mark. So it's an individual choice. All of us take that individual choice and look across and see the person inside the person. Be willing to do that first.
And with that injunction to all of us, would you join me in thanking this terrific panel? Thank you all. We're going to go that way. Judge, thank you.
For a session produced by the MacArthur Foundation, welcome Pamela Lattimore, the Director of the Center for Justice, Safety, and Resilience at RTI International, and Lori Garducki, the Criminal Justice Program Director at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here, and a special thanks to the Atlantic for hosting and organizing this event, as well as our other partners who joined us in funding this activity. And to all of you, thank you for being here. The morning has gotten off to a great start, raised some very critical and important questions around racial, social, and economic justice. And we're going to focus today on criminal justice. The title of this session is There a Crime Wave? Looking at the Local Level. And I'm joined on the stage this morning by Dr. Pamela Lattimore, Director of RTI's Center for Justice, Safety, and Resilience, located at Research Triangle Institute Park, which I understand is its own jurisdiction. RTI is a research, policy, and evaluation organization with clients all over the world, federal agencies, state and local governments, as well as foundations. They're our partner in our work. They are joining us as part of our Safety and Justice Challenge, the MacArthur Foundation's initiative to safely reduce unnecessary incarceration by changing the way America thinks about and uses jails. We're focusing on the front end of the criminal justice system, which begins with policing, which we've heard a great deal about this morning, but travels through corrections, the courts, and ends up in sentencing. It's a gateway, if you will, to the criminal justice system, but it has been largely overlooked when we've been thinking about criminal justice reform. We've looked at the very front end in terms of community residents' encounters with police, and we've looked at the back end with respect to sentencing and prisons. But the part of the system which is where most people in the community experience it and where many of these issues are resolved is with the use of jails. Now, jails admissions. What has struck us as we started this work is that the relatively lack of familiarity with what we know about jails. There are 12 million jail admissions annually in this country, which is 20 times the number of people who are admitted to prison. Cost about $22 billion, about a third of all of the costs of, that go into corrections, crime prevention, and the like, and policing. And it is one of the biggest cost centers for any local government. Now, MacArthur's committed to reducing the misuse and overuse of jails, and also to address racial and ethnic disparities in jail incarceration. But recently, a great deal of attention has been focused on the spike in crime and the recent statistics that have been put out by the Bureau of Justice from the Department of Justice. And I'm going to ask Pam to help us put those numbers in context and understand what that spike in the crime statistics, what does that represent?
Well, it represents a change from what we'd experienced over the last really 10 years or so, as we saw crime drop dramatically from the 1990s. And actually, it's an anomaly that the lower the rates are, the higher the increases are when you start to see increases. And so when you go from 50 homicides to 60 homicides in the course of a year, you're talking about a 20% increase, and which is a very big increase. Every homicide is one too many, but it seems that we may be getting out ahead. The national crime statistics, of course, are a summation of all the local crime statistics, but I think that the crime and the genesis of crime is a local issue, and it gets to opportunity, the ability and willingness of a community to invest resources into addressing the problems in the community. And when we fail to do that, we're going to see problems that manifest themselves, including crime.
And so you noted how crime is very much a local level. So when you look at the national statistics, are there ways of disaggregating those numbers that help us understand where the increase in crime is? Is this across the country?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that's one reason that there's an alarm over the most recent increase, because it does appear that the increase in violent crime is sort of across the board in small cities and large cities. But the largest amount of the increases are in a handful of large cities, which drives a national discussion, but doesn't really point to local solutions for, for example, what's happening in Charlotte.
So can you unpack those 12 million jail admissions and whether it's possible to safely reduce reliance on incarceration?
Well, I mean, you pointed out, I mean, it's a misunderstanding as to who we hold in our jails, and oftentimes we're holding individuals who are mentally ill. They're there because, as was just pointed out, there's no other resources in the community to take care of these individuals. I know I've lived in North Carolina for decades, and the approach of North Carolina to handling community-based mental health care shifts basically every 2 or 3 years. Is a new, oh, now we're going to go do it this way. And so it's a movement of sort of limited resources that doesn't really get to the problem. And so you've got the individuals who are mentally ill. I know it's been raised repeatedly over the course of the morning by a number of individuals that the inability of individuals to pay fees and fines directly impacts their ability to stay out of jail, and that's an issue for the community. Jail is, as you just pointed out, it's expensive, and when we put our monies into jail, it may be taking monies away from other places that would be more productive, and the collateral consequences to individuals when they end up in jail can be very severe, losing jobs, losing family, losing housing. If individuals in North Carolina don't pay their restitution and fines, they can lose their driver's license. In North Carolina, certainly, if you lose your driver's license, you're not going to be able to work. And so you get caught in a cycle of poverty that can end up with individuals spending lots of time in jail, and that doesn't get us anywhere.
So jails have largely become warehouses for poor people
and mentally ill people
that other systems have failed. So. Right. 2/3 of the people who are in jail are being held pre-trial, so are legally presumed to be innocent unless they're proven to be guilty. And then 3/4 of those individuals in jails are there for low-level, nonviolent, serious offenses. And substantial numbers of them are there because they can't make low-money bail or have failed to pay their fines and fees. Okay, so given that this cycle starts with arrest and moves through courts and corrections, are there ways to stop the flow of people in jail and ensure that those who remain in jail are those who pose a risk to public safety?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and obviously Mecklenburg is doing some of this, but diversion programs, I think particularly with youth, diversion programs, there was a study done 30 years ago that was an effort to look at the impact of arrest on juvenile reoffending. And the idea was, well, sort of a scared straight idea that if you arrest a child and take them to even if you don't end up prosecuting, that's going to result in a lower reoffending rate. They found the opposite. They found a significantly higher rearrest rate for the kids who were arrested. And Matt Klein, who did this research, went back to the police and said, why is this so? And all the police officers said, well, I saw that child in the police station. He'd already been arrested once, so now we know, so it was a labeling event. And so, you know how we treat our children, and obviously school resource officers have played an important role in safety, but to the extent that school resource officers become part of the school to prison pipeline, I think that's a significant problem. And so more diversion programs for individuals who don't pose risk to communities is certainly a way to save both monies with respect to jail, but also prisons. Most of my life I've studied adult corrections in prisons and probation and community supervision and looking for interventions at work. I mean, people need more opportunities, they need more education, and we need to think and rethink the severity and punitiveness of our systems.
So the challenges and I'm impressed by what you say about the importance of responding appropriately, not have the overreach of government, not have over-punishing, not criminalizing adolescent behavior or the crimes of poverty. But to line up all of those decision makers, you start with law enforcement, you go through the sheriff who runs the jail, you have your district attorneys, you have your public defenders, you have your judges, you have the mayor, the county board. That's a whole array of political officials that have different means of holding themselves accountable and responsible. That kind of alignment is difficult to achieve.
That's right, and I think that's why we as a country have had such a difficult time achieving it. But there are other things that we can do. I mean, you and I were talking last night about, and this morning about, improvements to physical environment can have an impact on violent crime, and proving that so opportunities for kids and young adults to get educated, to learn job skills, that's valuing the individual, taking good care of our communities and our neighborhoods, showing that you care, basically the reverse of broken windows, showing that you care about your neighborhoods and you can go in and clean up your neighborhoods, have been proven to reduce violent crime in neighborhoods.
So improving the criminal justice system, having a more fair, effective, equitable, and rational system in protecting public safety is responsible of all of our citizens. And we're very pleased to have Mecklenburg be one of the 40 jurisdictions in 25 states that's participating in the Safety and Justice Challenge, which we believe will show the way for other jurisdictions then to safely reduce unnecessary jail incarceration and reduce racial and ethnic disparities. So thank you, Pam.
Thank you
for joining us, and thank you all for being here.
To discuss the power of art, please welcome Annabelle Manning, a resident teaching assistant at the Jail Arts Initiative, here with Atlantic Assistant Editor Adrian Green.
Hi, Annabelle.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Awesome. So Charlotte has been looking at a bunch of ways to kind of serve its underserved community in housing and education. You're here to talk about the social impact of art.
Right.
Talk to me about the Jail Arts Initiative and kind of what drew you to that program.
Okay, so I'm a social practice artist. Can you hear me? And I approached the Beckler Museum because the jail program there was lacking in art programs for Latino inmates, and so we designed a program together, and we've been doing it for the last 5 years. And I go in there and I teach art to Latino inmates, and now I'm also branching out into other adult populations. And we go in there and we make art together for a period of 10 times, there are 10 sessions, 2 hours each, and we do it through a 10-week period. And So we can, the artwork is based upon what's in the Beckler collection, and currently we're working on a project with Miro, and I can continue telling you. I chose a special series of Miro's works. One is called Ladder of Escape, because it talks about sort of the idea of having your feet on the ground, but also reaching up through creativity to other worlds and reflecting on them and coming back down and having sort of that ability to sort of handle the real situation through the creative ladder. And then the second, yeah.
No, I was going to say, talk a little bit more about the structure of the program.
So then it's a maximum security prison. So before I even go in there, we have to have everything approved, all the different tools and things and supplies. I submit a curriculum that I work out with the Beckler Museum. And then I go in there and I have to go through a background check, et cetera. And the inmates choose to take the class. In other words, when the class is available, they go in and they ask a number of inmates, who would like to take the class. And so, that's how the class is formed. We get about 10 to 15 folks. And we go into this room, the door closes, and we stay there for 2 hours. We don't leave, no liquids, everything is counted. And also, the tools are very minimal too. We can use just a few different tools. And we get to play music, which is very rare, and they get to sort of interact with one another. So it's really, it provides a free space for them to, think about life, reflect on their issues through the visual art making.
So what you're saying is that they're kind of using the inspiration from the artists that you choose to kind of interpret that work about their own lives, using their own narratives.
Exactly, perfect.
Awesome. Well, we're going to actually get to take a look at some of their pieces. Talk to me about this piece and kind of were your students naturally artistic?
So this is very interesting. So I walk in there and I say, okay, how many of you have made art? And so slowly I see people sort of slipping things out of their little notebooks. And apparently you can, it's very limited, there's no color allowed or anything. Apparently you can make art on envelopes. So I said, well, how did you get that color? You're not allowed to take any of these, paints and stuff with you. And they say, aha, well, what I've done is I've taken Skittles, soap, a chicken bone, and Kool-Aid, and coffee grains. And through all these 5 different ingredients, they've created these colors. The green was done in class because you see there's a little green there, but I gave him a pencil and he was able to do that. So they are able to then, not this particular one, but in general, they can take these envelopes and they can actually make themselves visible because they are in this sort of state of invisibility, locked up. This is one way that they can make themselves visible by taking these envelopes and mailing something to their friends and family. So this was really interesting that they had found their own way of making art. So there you go. There's that art that's in that jail somewhere in spite of me. I just come in and allow them to use more tools and have some fun with them.
And so this is one of the pieces that you use as inspiration for your students. Why did you think this particular piece would speak to them?
Well, because this is Miro's Hope of the Condemned Man, and he's done a whole series of these works. I figured that this kind of topic could sort of be, could relate to their own situation, given that they're incarcerated, they're condemned in some way. And so I tested it, and so I put it up on the monitor, and we had a discussion about that, and they really responded to it and gave me a few interpretations about what they thought this piece meant in terms of, first of all, what they saw, and then later on they were able to create their own version of this. So we kind of worked both ways. So there's just a lot of, it's open to interpretation, which is really, so we sit around as a class and they give me interpretations of this piece. And yeah. And so then this is a piece that was done by one of the participants in these art workshops. And given that they're Latinos, most of them undocumented, so they're in for that and possibly other things. We don't discuss that too much. But here, you have this flag, which is a Bolivian flag, and then they're just kind of creating another version of this. and the lines are sort of the body that's incarcerated, it's sort of that space, and then the dots are the body, in other words. So they're incarcerated, they're sort of, in this case, he said he was dying, and in the third, he was, going to some other place. So it was a little bit grim, actually.
You mentioned that many of your students, excuse me, are undocumented. How does that kind of influence the way that they express themselves through art? You mentioned that this is influenced on a Bolivian flag.
Right.
How do you kind of see their status as undocumented?
Well, that's why I also picked Miró, because he in some way was Catalan in Spain and sort of had that sort of dual relationship and struggles with his identity. And so that sort of they struggle with their identity. And, they're given even less rights because they're undocumented. So they don't even have rights that, a regular sort of legal person has. So they're starting from even a lower level. And so this space that they have, they're given some freedom to sort of just exercise whatever they would like to do visually about themselves, about their lives. I see it as a really important program. Yeah.
So you talked earlier about Miro's ladder of escape and the recurring motif of escape in some of the students' work.
Right.
I imagine that this creates a sense of community between the inmates that might not otherwise be able to foster that.
Right.
Are there times when the jail kind of encroaches, when they possibly can't use art as kind of the escapism that they might want to? Is there a way that being in a jail kind of impacts the way that they look at art?
Well, yeah, this is the only, if I understand your question correctly, this is the only space where they can sort of talk freely, listen to music, and express some of their feelings. They don't really have those moments where other moments where they can do that. So they have 2 hours in a 10-week period to do this, and then I leave. This is just an example of, actually this artist called it, "There are no chains around love and dreams." And I see that, this particular participant was really sort of exploring the idea quite in depth. And the pencil just sort of, with the pencil you see some of the details. I thought it was, had a lot of impact. Yeah.
Absolutely. So here's one of the inspiration art called the Nanas.
Yeah, so this is based on a series by Nikki de Sanfal. I mentioned Miró, but another artist, her name is Nikki de Sanfal, and she has a series of Nana figures, which in French means chick, sort of strong, powerful woman. And the strong, powerful woman is expressed in her physicality. And so I approached females and males and asked them if they, to think about sort of whether they wanted to impersonate themselves as a powerful woman or create a powerful woman, in their lives. And so that last one was done with paper mache. She's a mosaic artist, so of course I can't bring in bricks and whatever. So I took tissued paper and broke it up, and that was the kind of motif that we used instead of the mosaic. And so they created that, and that was a woman holding a child and sort of escaping through taking the balloon as a means of escape. This was done an iteration of that, where you take the drawing or the collage and you put under a piece of glass, and then you do a painted version of that. So you just basically paint over on this glass, put a piece of paper on it, and create a monoprint. So there are different iterations that they can create, from this particular topic of the Nana.
As you're watching your students kind of interpret their lives in the works of these artists, what are you learning from them about art as you're kind of participating in the process with them?
Well, first of all, when they pulled out all the artwork that they were doing, I realized that I was there for a reason. Art was in the minds and bodies of some of these folks, and this was just, I was convinced that giving them some more materials to work with and more concepts and ways of reflecting on things and using visual medium was a good thing to do. It seemed like it was going to be a helpful thing for them.
Absolutely. And so this is just a picture of your students.
Since it's maximum security and you can't take photographs, we created this little piece where they are all, of course, covering their faces with them working on their art. This is just a sort of self-representation. The art becomes a way for them to represent themselves instead of what people see in the public sphere are these mugshots. And so this is we're creating other forms of finding ways that they can represent themselves. And currently at the Beckler Museum, there's a show of female nanas and their poetry. So we're trying to get it out more into the public so that they can see, what's really happening in the jail, what can happen, what, the things are going on that are things that they're learning skills through these processes of art.
And so I quickly just wanted to kind of take a step back. As we talk about kind of social mobility in Charlotte, there's a lot of ways that we've talked about achieving that through education, through criminal justice reform. What place do you think that art plays in kind of developing social mobility for these underserved communities?
Yeah, so I see art, it's sort of like if you were look at the prison industrial complex, I see it as, sort of before going into some sort that complex, then, once you're in the prison, then you're sort of, afterwards you're, you leave the prison and then you think beyond the prison, like abolition or something of that nature. So it's these different phases, and the power of art plays a role in all of these different phases. And so I've done before, which right now I'm working on a before project, which is teaching art and literacy to Latino families and their preschoolers. So I'm teaching them art through literacy. Literacy through art, but I'm also teaching the families how to teach their young ones, to encourage them to learn, and visual art plays a large role in that.
Absolutely. You mentioned literacy, and I know that you have a poem that you'd like to read that one of your students wrote, and then we're going to go to questions quickly right after you read that.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I'm working on this Charlotte Arts and Mobility Project because, as we know, just given the current situation, I feel like art can really contribute to upward mobility, and so we're working on a project that is addressing that. Okay, so this is the poem. Okay, and so the way it works is that in addition to making artworks, we create poems, and it's really important to create the poems because oftentimes, if you just looked at the artwork, you wouldn't necessarily know that a lot of these people are incarcerated. But when you read the poems, and you see them together, then it just kind of deepens your understanding of everything. Okay, I am humble and original. I wonder why there is so much wrong. I hear the wind. I see heaven. I want to express what I feel. I am a foreigner and a poet. I pretend to fly like a kite. I feel I am falling into an abyss. I touch hearts like all human beings. I worry that I am not the same. I cry because I am not the same man. I am my future and present. I understand my past brought me to this place. I say what is done will come around. I dream of light. I try to see life differently. I hope someday sadness will not exist. I am impatient and homosexual. So, okay.
It was very impactful. Well, Annabelle, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you, Adrian. This is not on the agenda, but because you've been such a wonderful audience, I think you deserve a stretch break. And this is going to be a fast stretch break. This is a get up, put out your arms, say hello to your neighbor, check 1, maybe 2 emails. This is not a walk out of the room and get coffee break, because we want everybody back, because in just a couple of minutes, I can see that everybody's listening. You really need a break. In a couple of minutes, the chief of police is going to be on the stage. So see you back here in a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Please take your seats. The program will resume momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will resume momentarily. Next, welcome Kerr Putney, the Chief of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and welcome back Atlantic staff writer Van Newkirk.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Chief, for joining us today.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thanks for
taking
having
the
me.
time. So I wanted to kick this off with two black men talking on stage. A question.
Let's just ignore them then, right? Done.
Well, I did want to ask a question that was been burning on my mind for the past couple days since we announced we were going to do this. Is, as a black man, as an African American, what has your experience, your life experience with policing been like, and how does it interact with how you do the job today?
Wow, that's a very good question. I'll start with the journey to get here. It's just a different journey. I never intended to be in this profession. Grew up never really trusting, having very much respect for the profession, mainly because of my experience. My father, I felt, was murdered back when I was 10, and I felt the local authorities refused to investigate it, and I believed that it was because of his race. I believed it because he was black. And that stayed with me into my early 20s. A friend of mine wanted to get into this work, first black man I ever met who always had that interest. A fraternity brother of mine, so we were very close. He applied to the then Charlotte Police Department, which was before the merger, was denied, and so I said, watch this. I intended to demonstrate the racism that was there, even in the hiring process. Applied in April, was hired in August, and have been here ever since. So my calculation was a little bit off.
So with those experiences, with dealing with what you saw as racism, not only in how policing was applied, but in its internal practices, how do you view people who are today, after Keith Lamont Scott, after Ruben Galindo, who are saying, I don't trust police?
Sure.
Communities who are saying, I don't trust police.
I understand it, but I would say don't take 20 plus years like I did to get to know a few of them on a human level, to get to have a conversation like we're having. And we do a lot of that because there's a lot of conversation that I have with people about the legal standard. And I think meeting the legal standard is easy. There's a higher moral and ethical standard that takes into consideration the racial impact we're having on families and everything else that we need to try to achieve. And we got to connect on a human level to do so.
And what is the department, let's start with, what has it learned over the past year What is the feedback from the community? What are people telling you that they need from their police department?
We need to be much more open and show them exactly what's going on inside of our organization. And it's more than just riding with an officer. I think that's the easy way out. But it's showing exactly what we do, why we do it, and then allowing that community to weigh in on how you can do it better. And that's a part of what we're doing with our transparency workshops. That's how we're modifying our Citizens Academy. But ultimately, it's also how we're listening when we have these in-depth conversations with people all over the city.
What's a Citizens Academy?
Citizens Academy is it's about 9 months long, and we give you soup to nuts experience of how we're trained, how we apply our policies, and also it helps us fill in those gaps in the policies. But ultimately, it shows people what we do as a profession and how we train our people and how we socialize new people coming into this line of work.
And you said that's been going on for how long?
That's been going on for over a decade.
Over a decade.
Yes, but we've been fine-tuning it over the last couple of years because I think it was more look at it from our perspective than having it much more mutual.
Mm-hmm. And how have people responded to making it, like you say, more mutual?
About 150 recommendations. We keep having a lot of feedback that we're getting where people are telling us specifically where they think we're off target. And ultimately, it is connecting across racial lines to have conversations where we can really be open and honest about owning our history as a profession and trying to change those negative outcomes that continue to surface as we do our work.
Well, how do you change those outcomes, though, when you're talking about people who may be seeing the hand of racism again and the killing of people on the streets and people who died in officer-involved shootings? They say, okay, that's racist. Sure. And you have an experience yourself that you think is racist. How do you reach out in good faith to people and say, okay, it's not? Or how do you alleviate those concerns?
I love it. The main way is you have to experience it. I can talk to you all day, but until you experience both sides, you're never going to speak from a position of true insight. And it helps us too, because we have white officers at the table with black young kids who are telling them why they perceive not only them individually, but their profession as racist. And then we have to do some self-reflection. We have a year-long cultural competence course that we go into with a professor out of Smith. And it's more internal work. But you also make a comment that everybody does. They make the leap from implicit bias and racism all the way to, okay, another black or Latino just got shot. And I say we have to pause a bit because there's a lot of things that are happening that are, I think, not as interrelated as we try to make them. Because the legal standard that I talked about that's easy to achieve as far as lethal force, even though it's in a racial context, that split-second decision is what we're struggling to get people to understand, that there are a lot of cultural factors that might drive that collision, but at that moment, I find it hard to say race is the reason, because what we're trying to preach here is, and I tell the young black males in particular, don't let anybody who might have a racial connotation or perspective of you act on that legally. In that instant, that moment, I believe we're allowing for whatever perception we have or that person, that officer has to act on. And that's where we're missing the boat. We should be talking about how we engage with officers, and if I'm armed, put the gun down. Live to have your day in court. Live to fight the very perspective and racism as you see it. But don't give your life for that. We're trying to change our conversation to be a bit more practical at that key moment and then philosophical down the road as we can build on the trust and the legitimacy that we're needing in this profession.
Are there certain basic rights you would expect to have at a police stop?
Absolutely.
And how do you cotton with, so there are certain things in that split second that may be difficult, that may be, point-to-point decisions that you can't get in somebody's brain, but when you see people who are looking at the outcomes, who are saying, okay, black folks are killed twice the rate of white folks in police stops, how do you say, okay, we're going to disaggregate that from the individual officer's decision.
I don't. I don't have to. The Supreme Court has. What I'm saying is we got to do work on the front end, because what people gloss over too is right now in Charlotte, 75% of my homicide victims are black. And yeah, it gets that quiet. 78% of my homicide suspects are black. And it gets that quiet. We have to do work on the front end if we're serious about changing outcomes, because if we were proportional in the homicide rate, y'all would be saying, great job, Chief. We've only had 42 murders versus 45 last year. But that's not what we're saying. We're saying, oh my God, we've had 75. 54 of them are black. Chief, won't you change that in that split second, because we keep saying these negative outcomes. What I'm saying is the work goes on the front end before you measure on the back end. And my misperception was you could chalk it all up to race and bias. The reality is not. The reality is we have to do work changing humans at a younger age. We also have to do work changing education opportunities. We have to mentor. We have to give up ourselves, our time, our energy, and some of our finances to help people who are struggling, who have no hope. Because I believe the hopelessness when it collides in that split second is what frustrates me and hurts me as a black man. Because there's a lot of history that are pushing us on that collision course. I don't mean to dominate the conversation. As you see, I have a little bit of passion around that topic.
It's a question and answer. You're
Yes, sir.
answering.
Yes, sir.
I'm only asking
Yes,
the questions. But for me, as a black kid who grew up on Beatty's Ford Road,
yes, sir.
Right, I saw people who were shot and killed before my 5th birthday.
Yes.
I would say part of the hopelessness is because people don't feel they can trust the authorities, whether it be police, first
whatever
responders,
system. Yes, sir.
whatever system,
Yes,
to
yes.
come and help. And so,
Yes.
how do you, especially in the wake of the last 2 years, say, okay, it's a hopelessness problem or it's a character problem when people are just don't feel that they can trust anyone above the level of themselves? That's what people buy guns, I think.
Sure. Why they buy guns is again part of the culture that I talk about. This is a gun-toting country. But to speak to the other piece of it, what I'm saying is our work as an organization now can't be just dealing with split-second decisions. Our work has to be changing those outcomes. The reason there is so little trust is because until we're having to force it now, these difficult conversations that aren't easy at younger ages, so that people can also see that not all cops are bad, although we do have some bad cops. But being able to understand that we also have an obligation to change that equation. I think you have a lot of things that drive us, and what we keep missing too, and I know this isn't well received, but I don't care, y'all asked me to come here, is there's a failure on behalf of adults and parents to start these connections at a young age so we don't have that fear. It makes no sense that 20 years and 30 years of your life you have this fear that you haven't been able to challenge and get a better understanding. And that's separate and apart from the outcomes that we keep hearkening back to.
Well, walk me through this, okay?
Yes, sir.
You have a person who, like yourself, has an experience as a child, and they say, okay, this system is corrupt.
Yes.
I don't want to deal with it. And they may be in the right in some cases, in most cases. And how do you move on from saying, okay, they have to teach their kids to not believe it's corrupt? There seems to be a disconnect there between what you're expecting people to do and their lived experiences.
Not at all. I'm modeling it. I have 2 young boys and they happen to be black. That's science that I don't understand, but it always turns out that way. So what I'm teaching them though is we're going to challenge, because you say it's the reality. And I thought, and it was my reality for 20 plus years, but what I see is that reality was kind of narrowly focused on that experience that happened 12 and 14 years ago. So I have to be open to the conversation, and we keep talking about difficult conversation. It's not just the conversation. Talk starts a movement. Then you got to move. Then you got to do something. And what I'm telling my boys is, don't be quick to judge everything as an excuse of race. Because I had a kid, quick experience, who went to school and teacher tells them both sit down. One kid's white. My kid, as I told you by biology, black. And they both didn't sit down the first time. Tells them again, my boy knew dad was at home. So he sat down Other kid continued to stand up, and he goes, you know, didn't anything happen to that kid in his race? I said, well, maybe it's deeper than that. I said, you got a dad at home who's gonna lose his mind if he has to take time off work to deal with you. What I'm saying is, there comes an opportunity too for personal responsibility. And I can't just let them put it on. Race is a major problem. I'm not disputing that. But it's not all, what I've seen is it's not all just race. There are a lot of other systems that put us in that position too. So if we're not gonna start when they're young, we're gonna lose yet another generation and have yet another conversation and panel and everything else 10 and 15 years from now because we haven't done enough to change outcomes. And outcomes starts with that trust, that conversation, and shattering some of those stereotypes. And that's where we're putting a lot of our energy and work right now.
So within that framework of multiple systems that you're identifying and people themselves, is there a role for policing, maybe not to just change the outreach or to change its perception, but the actual mechanics of policing, how a stop works, how police respond to individual incidents, what the protocol is? Are there things that people are asking for and that have been changed or can be changed?
Sure. One of the main ones is that bias, that perspective, that stereotyping. And I'll tell you this, what I've seen in our culture is a part of what we say about survival comes down to stereotyping. It does. Profiling. It does. You're looking to quickly analyze and surmise what you're going to encounter with this person just based on their sight, just based on what they look like. And what we've learned is there's a huge problem with that because I'm making a huge generalization, right? And then once a number of sequence of events start to happen, you can always fall back on what we're talking about today, which is race, and race plays a role in it. So what we're trying to do is first connect so we can shatter the stereotypes in a sterile environment so that when you have emotion and tension and everything else, you at least have a frame of mind knowing, why am I categorizing this person who I don't know, and where might that lead in this encounter? You're at least having a second to step back and think about it on a deeper level of just then whether or not I'm going to survive today, because it's bigger than that. If we're not talking about how we all survive, we're not having the right conversation.
Well, how do you engage and measure that, though?
Ultimately, it's the work I do every week when we're coming into environments that are not this big, but a lot smaller, a lot more manageable, and having cops at the table, having these conversations with people different than them so that we can shadow those stereotypes. And that is the ground game. The other thing is what we do in that year-long cultural proficiency, where we talk about a lot of things beyond race. We talk about privilege and everything else to get you trained here and here. I can teach you how to do the job here. I can't impact some of this. So we want to bring that out. And if you're not the right kind of person for this work, we want to get you out of it.
And how do you measure that, though, in the actual field and during a stop?
Sure. Well, what I'll tell you is this. I can't measure it in outcomes on the stop. How I can measure it is when we have little young Black and Latinos who are teaching white officers Spanish and wanting to go to dinner and spend time with them and calling them by their first name. We keep going back to what we can tell in the data, and what the data is never going to show us is what we have to overcome in the history and the culture. So we're doing that type of work so that when you have these encounters, there's a different frame of reference. And if that's going to pay dividends over the next 2 years, probably not. But I can tell you it's changing lives as we speak right now. That's the heavy lifting. That's the work that's going to, I think, pay huge dividends down the road.
So we're talking data, and I know it's rough, small sample sizes, difficulty doing over time. But I think a lot of folks are saying, okay, last year, and I say we because this is my community, we had Keith Scott. We had the people who were protesting. We had anger and violence on the streets after that. And there were a series of steps that the department took, that the community took, to hopefully change that from happening again. And then you have now Ruben Galindo, people who are saying, okay, nothing has changed.
Well, here's the deal. If you want to talk about data, last year we had 12 officer-involved shootings, 12, 5 were fatal. This year we have a total of 4 that have happened in 3. So are you gonna say that that's a success based on the work that this community did? I say, get out of here. Not even close. We've just been lucky. What I'm saying is the work takes a lot more to do. And if my question is, how do you quantify success? If it is the number of officer-involved shootings, I think we're way, way too low. I think that's an excuse to get away from the systemic work we have to do in this profession, in education, and a lot of other places that we keep debating about. Look at what we're talking about right here, since you want to make it relevant to home. We're talking about where our kids go to school. And I say, why are we having that conversation? And we talk about a lot about the data around the value of my home. What we're really talking about is this history in this city around race that we're too cowardly to really honestly address. So if you want to talk about data, let's start there. Let's start there.
I'm going to open up for questions in 1 minute, but final question from me. It seems like the final metric here should not be, like you said, officer-involved shootings, should not be these individual encounters. It should be whether people trust their police and the authorities generally to act on their behalf. How can the department and how can you sort of, what is your report card if the community is saying, okay, we don't trust you?
Thank you. Thank you. Great question. Can we give him a hand? Great question. Yes. Thank you. I was hoping that's what you were going to ask, but I was hesitant at the end. What we're going to do is we're going to be hyper-specific by geography, where we measure the level of trust, all right, and have the community also prioritize what is most important in that neighborhood. And then we're going to do the work that we're doing with a lot of our partners in the Community Empowerment Initiative, where we have service providers come in and do the work we're talking about, mentor the kids and help them with tutoring and everything else that this great community can do. And then a year later, we come back and measure. I can assure you, what we're going to see is reading levels go up, respect for authority goes up, hope goes up, the police, our satisfaction level and perception of us goes up. That's how we're going to specifically quantify, but that's a year from now. What I'm saying is we need as a community to come in and do the work right now, or we're not going to have a very good report card at all in 12 months.
All right, questions?
Hi, my name is Sam Poehler.
Hello.
With the Freedom Center for Social Justice. So in light of the fact that the current police in the US are historically founded in slave patrols, and the fact that the 13th Amendment explicitly allows for slave labor as long as it's facilitated through the prison system, how do you reconcile yourself as someone continuing to perpetuate slavery in the United States?
I think that's a very silly question to ask of me, to be honest with you, because perpetuate slavery? Are you aware that that we as an organization divert about 750 young Black and Latinos out of the system every year to the tune of 2,200? So if I were perpetuating slavery, I wouldn't even be able to recite that number. I wouldn't care. We're trying to break cycles that we talk about are systemic beyond just policing. So what I say is, where is the other work of all the other systems, agencies that can collaborate to change those outcomes? What I can tell you is I do believe incarceration in large numbers has the same outcome, but it has a more dramatic outcome because it does break up the families in ways even slavery couldn't. So I'm well aware, we're well attuned to that, doing a lot of work proactively to break that cycle, and quite frankly, a little bit offended that the assertion could be applied that we are trying to perpetuate slavery.
So Chief, Toussaint Romaine back. I know you well, Chief. I know that you want to have a clean and very efficient police department. Part of the protest last year was not just for affordable housing or for other issues. It was because officers were not being held accountable. You mentioned 17 officers who were involved in police-related shootings and not one was held accountable. I know within your department, though, that 70% of all police complaints are filed by other police officers. So I'm wondering if you can speak to us about the work that you're already trying to do and the work that we need to do as a community to have more police accountability.
Yes, and I'll tell you this. Thank you, sir, for your question. Our issue really revolves around what does that accountability really look like? Because if you go back beyond 2 years, if you go back 4 years, we did more than just have 70% of our people, report misbehavior. We had an officer-involved shooting that was, even on its surface, illegal. We arrested the officer, and the officer went to trial. And those of you who've been here a while know what happened. So accountability would be we hold them accountable, and then the rest of the system is where it went awry. I'm going to tell you this. If we didn't wholeheartedly believe a crime had been committed, we wouldn't have made an arrest. But the accountability on the back end is where it went awry, and that was a jury. So the whole system, and it works as a system does. There's no perfect outcome when you talk about accountability. What I'm most proud of is our people are proactive in holding one another to the high standards that we have as an organization.
How you doing? Melody
Hello.
Rose. Hi. My question is, you mentioned that the data doesn't tell the whole story and doesn't give the context, but 2 minutes prior to that, you mentioned how 75% of your crime victims were assaulted by or
Yes.
perpetuated by other black people.
Yes.
So where's the context for that?
Yes.
What caused that? And then,
Right.
what's the other percentage of white on white crime, Latino on Latino crime? Because we all know that crime happens where we live.
Yes. What I'll tell you is the vast majority of crime is intra-racial, right? It's black on black or white on white. What I'm telling you too, though, we're talking about today race and justice. And what I'm telling you too about is we're talking about what drives our work and where we go. And if you look at the data that exists, we're having to consistently go where we think the amount of hope and resources is lacking the most, and it happens to be in those communities that are black and Latino. And I think part of what drives those numbers, and the reason I put those numbers out there is we're losing a lot of black people, and it's not just, as people would lead you to believe, at the hands of the police. I think we need to do a lot of work in that area, but we got to be serious that there's a lot of things driving that we need to attack at a lower level that is beyond even the control of just one profession like policing. That was the point of that context.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Chief.
Time? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And thank
Always.
you. So, yeah, thank you for joining us.
Always, brother. Thank you, my friend. Hey, good to see you, homeboy.
For a conversation on reforming juvenile justice, please welcome District Court Judge Louis Trosh, a co-chair of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. Ricky Watson, the co-director of the Youth Justice Project of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And Eric Zograi, the state's juvenile public defender. To lead the conversation, welcome back the Atlantic's Adrian Green.
You gonna sit back? Okay. I'm leaning back. Good.
Welcome, guys.
Hello. Hey.
Hello.
Hi. So we're here to talk about juvenile justice reform. Judge Trosh, I want to start with you. You've been kind of a district judge for nearly 2 decades. What have you seen change about juvenile justice in that time?
First, I lost all my hair. But no, I've seen a real progression in this community of systems working together. So Chief Putney was just out here, and the police department, when I first started, we didn't work a lot with the police department. Since that time, under Chief Monroe and now Chief Putney's leadership, we partner with them. They have a diversion program to try and keep juveniles out of the juvenile court system. They educate all their officers on implicit bias. We have similar partnerships with the school system, the Department of Social Services, and working together, I think we now own the reality that there's a lot of disproportionality. That hasn't changed over the 20 years that I've been a judge. The people that come in front of me, the children, the juveniles, are children of color for the most part. That has not changed. What has changed is our recognition in the role that we play as institutions and what we can do together to try and change those numbers.
Ricky, you work a lot with the youth during your Youth Justice Project. Can you talk to me about kind of your experiences working with them and what you've learned about the disparities that Judge Trosh mentioned?
So Judge Trosh is absolutely correct. The disparities that exist in the court systems are clear. I worked first as a public defender in Guilford County, and I worked directly with youth who were being referred to court, and overwhelmingly they were Black minority students. In my work with the Youth Justice Project and in the campaign to push for raising the age, did a lot of community education around trying to just educate folks about the juvenile system, the adult system, and the differences between the two and the benefits of treating and having youth in the juvenile system rather than the adult system if you're going to have them in any system at all. A lot of education not only of young people but also adults, folks who weren't really familiar with the systems that we're talking about and that we're working in. Really trying to explain to folks that the real difference in the juvenile system and the adult system is that there's more rehabilitation, and that's where we'd rather see our youth.
Absolutely. Eric, North Carolina recently passed a raise the age bill, meaning that they'll no longer prosecute 16 and 17-year-olds as adults automatically. It was the last state in the country to kind of pass a bill of that measure. Why do you think it took so long?
Well, it's been the law for almost 100 years, and it's just as problematic to figure out why we had the law in the first place to go back and fix it. But I think that the work that local advocates had done, the information, the education on adolescent brain development, U.S. Supreme Court cases, there was a lot of things coming together at the same time. And I think one thing that's important to discuss is it was never really a partisan issue. It was always sort of a bipartisan push to get this done. And the culmination really was the Chief Justice's Commission on the Administration of Law and Justice and their report making the recommendations and again sort of building the case based on adolescent development, that kids are different, and you know, making the case that way.
Ricky, Judge Trosh, do you?
Absolutely. I think that the Judges Committee did a great job of really being evidence-based and rooted in science, you know, things that actually really matter, that prove that brain development doesn't really finish until people are in their mid-20s. I think that those types of examples of reasons why we need to be developmentally minded and focused in how we approach handling misbehavior or criminal activity is key. It was key to seeing Raise the Age pass and become successful. The devil is really going to be in the details of implementation and how we move forward in making sure that it's actually carried out in a way that's effective and meaningful for as many kids as possible.
And if I could address that, I think that is a critical issue. So the law goes into effect in 2019, December of 2019, which means we've got about 2 years to get ready. I know the state, and built into the law is a commission that's going to be looking on it. I think, Eric, you're sitting on that commission and Ricky, I don't know, I think you might be on it.
I'm not on it.
You're not on it.
We
You should be on it.
Yeah.
But at any rate, they're going to be looking at what do you do, the devil, what is the devil in the details? We didn't wait for that commission to get started here. We partnered with the county, and the county was really, has exercised a lot of leadership to pull a committee together here in Mecklenburg County to look at our numbers, which are frankly a lot different than what the state is predicting, and to figure out what are we going to do about detention facilities, what are we going to do about transportation, what are we going to do about court resources. So it's a great idea philosophically. It needed to happen. It was many, many, many decades. It should have happened long ago. But we do need the community's support in figuring out how do we now implement this law, because it will cause great changes in both the adult criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system.
Rick, I was going to say, talk about how the importance of including youth voices in kind of the transition between now and 2019.
So I think it's critical, and just to go back to one point, Representatives Moore and Berger are the ones who will be appointing or selecting those 2 community advocates for young people. They don't want me on the committee. Hopefully they will appoint people who have worked with us and done this work and made sure that they were advocating for all children. But I think that in terms of having a young person's voice or young people's voices involved, it's critical. But it's hard to do. You've got to think about the sensitivity of being in juvenile court in the first place, right? The whole benefit, one of the benefits of being in juvenile court is that your record is protected, right? In very rare circumstances, it can be open, but it's typically such that nobody's going to know that you were necessarily in a juvenile court. So to find people to say, oh, well, talk to us about the benefits of why you're happy that you were able to be in juvenile court as opposed to being, thrown into the adult system, sometimes that was really hard to do. Or oftentimes it was really hard to do. So what we were able to do was find folks who have been directly impacted and harmed by being involved in the adult system, and how just because they were 16 and a half or 16 in one day, they were thrown into the adult system, whereas their peers who might have been 15 and 364 days old were in the juvenile system, and that's how arbitrary the law was. Those are the types of instances that really show people that are still trying to get back on track, that have just come out of being in jail, and they're still, or in prison, and they're still trying to figure out how to get out of it. But that's the cycle that happens when you're thrown into really any system, but especially the adult prison system. Those are the types of things that we're really trying to get out there so that people can understand and that they can remember that we're not done. Like, yes, we've raised the age on paper, but it hasn't taken effect yet. It's going to be 2 years, and there are a lot of kids that are going to fall through that gap of about 2 years where they're not going to receive the benefits of being in juvenile court.
Absolutely. Eric?
Well, I agree with all that. There's a lot to be done. As Judge Trosh mentioned, Charlotte's looking into this. Just last Friday, I was in Kinston, North Carolina, and that gathered together not only court personnel, but mental health personnel and law enforcement, school officials, guardians ad litem. There's a lot of folks who are concerned about how to move forward, but I think both on the state wide level, but also on the community level, people are having these conversations. We're trying to encourage them because, we have 100 counties in the state. Each county runs differently, and you got to know how it's going to impact you specifically. So, I'm glad to hear that's happening, and we're trying to help facilitate when we can.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that this is kind of a bipartisan effort. But Judge Trosh, you recently, after being a lifelong Republican, have now become a Democrat. How has that changed?
Give me some love.
At least you're getting some love. How has that changed how you view the bill and how partisanship affects the courts?
I don't think it changed. First of all, I don't think partisanship should affect the bench at all. I think the bench is and should be an independent branch of government. I think that's under assault across the country. That's in large part why I changed parties, because I couldn't, that and many other reasons, but I couldn't be a part of a party that was trying to dismantle the institution that I have chosen as my career. But the issue itself of raise the age, I don't think it should matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It was the right thing to do for kids, and it was the right thing to do for the state. So I would agree with both my colleagues' comments that it really was across the aisle. I think everybody realized that it was the right thing to do, whether they were Republicans or Democrats. The devil, though, is in the details. And again, we've got 2 years to plan for what's going to happen.
Absolutely. I want to transition a little bit to talking about schools. Schools play a major role in referring, students into the juvenile justice system. What do you think that raise the age, what effect do you think raise the age will have on schools and the school to prison pipeline as we know it?
So first of all, we have an initiative here called Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, which is an initiative specifically that looks at what do institutions, all the institutions that I mentioned earlier that touch the lives of children, what do we do to exacerbate or worsen disproportionality and disparities for children of color? And so there's a lot of work that's done. I'm going to give a plug. October 30th, there is a conference, our second biannual conference, community conference. Go on the RMJJ website. It's at Crown Plaza. There are many people I can kind of see out there that are from RMJJ. Ask somebody about it, but that's something to get involved in. But to your question, As an outgrowth of that, we then learned of efforts across the country for schools to partner with law enforcement, to partner with the court system, to partner with juvenile probation, to try and keep cases out of the court system. Because in the 1990s, with the zero tolerance policies, we began to get two kids get into a fight. When I was in school, we got paddled. Maybe when you were in school, you got suspended. But now, in the late 90s, they were coming to the court system. And so we partnered with the school system, and they've changed their disciplinary policies, and we have classes of offenses that just don't come to juvenile court. I think that raise the age is going to up the ante for that for kids that are 16 and 17 years old as well. So hopefully, things that need to be dealt with in the schools will be dealt with in the schools instead of people that are wearing black dresses.
Ricky, I see you nodding your head a bunch.
Yeah, I agree with what Judge just said. I think a key part of the new legislation is the school justice partnerships component that kind of will require that school systems figure out how to address behaviors that should be handled and addressed either in schools or outside of court, but through other means that are productive and meaningful for folks, and then kind of educate folks as opposed to just like, hey, let's punish you. I think that once we figure out how to divert folks from court into other places that are going to be positive and productive for them, we'll be a lot better off. And I think that we've got to also get some better training for school resource officers. If we're going to have them in schools, we've got to figure out how to educate them so that they know that they shouldn't be the first line of defense in terms of addressing or handling problems that occur in schools.
I see you.
Well, one thing to know is even though the number of complaints coming into North Carolina courts have dropped pretty precipitously, if I said that correctly, the rate of kids coming from school has remained the same. It's like between 40 and 42% for the last 10 or 12 years, and it's really a tough nut to crack. School Justice Partnership is going to be a great piece to that. I also think it's really, really important to educate the school resource officers and other law enforcement, specifically on adolescent development and implicit bias. I know historically the number of hours that you need to take to satisfy basic law enforcement accreditation has been very small, but the bill puts that in there, and we really need to focus on that, hopefully in partnership with the Attorney General's office and the law enforcement community.
Absolutely. We mentioned racial disparities a bunch throughout our time together. And I want to talk about how that impacts North Carolina specifically, given that this law deals specifically only with misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. How do we think that this law will affect the types of racial disparities that happen, given that it excludes violent felonies?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that when you're dealing with young people and youth, I mean, the majority of the offenses that you're going to see across the board, about 80% of them are going to be nonviolent misdemeanors and some of the lower level felonies. Essentially, what you've got to do is figure out how to get rid of those subjective offenses that you see when people are in classes and in schools. The offenses that, disrespect or talking back, things that, maybe can be overlooked or treated in a different way. Once we start seeing some of those types of crimes not sent to court but addressed in other ways, I think we'll be a lot better off.
Judge Strash?
Well, there was a study in Texas called Breaking School Rules that addressed exactly what you're talking about, which basically found that they studied 100,000 kids in the school system, and this was about disciplinary actions in the school system, but it relates to which cases get sent to court as well. So they studied 100,000 kids, and they studied what their actions were, and because they had such a large number of children that they were following on a longitudinal basis, they were able to control for, I think it's 80 factors. How many? I've got our professor from the UNC. 83 factors. I'm sorry, not 80, 83 factors. So basically, they could compare almost identical children and what happened when they engaged in behaviors like talking back to a teacher or getting into a fight with another student. And literally, you could have a student, a white student, and a black student in the same school coming from literally almost the exact same background that lived next door to each other, engaged, saying the exact same thing to their teacher, and the response was entirely different. Whereas the white student might get a note sent home to the parent, the African American student was much more likely to be suspended from school and or reported to the court system. So those are the kind of discretionary offenses that we're trying to deal with in our school partnerships as well as in RMJJ, because that's where you see disparities that just shouldn't be there.
Absolutely. We mentioned that we have 2 years before this bill fully takes into effect, 2019. And we've talked so much about how the devil is in the details and how there's going to be a lot of things that have to be kind of implemented in the meantime. What does this bill not take care of? What are some issues facing this community that are not going to be swept up in this bill?
We've got a report that we're actually going to be releasing pretty soon that kind of addresses some of the issues with the juvenile system as a whole. But I mean, overall, I think we need to improve our juvenile system. We need to strengthen it so that it's prepared to handle and address issues that occur in juvenile court. One thing that I'll throw out there is the fact that we have, of the states that actually have lower threshold ages for juvenile jurisdiction, you can be 6 years old in North Carolina and go to juvenile court. And we think that's way too low. So we think you should start there. Raising that minimum juvenile age to, I don't know, maybe 10, 11 would be a great start.
Absolutely. Eric.
Well, there's a whole host of things, and I think folks know that, you know, when we worked on the bill initially, we were just trying to get a package together that we knew would be successful, but we also knew there were going to be issues and holes. There's some things that are somewhat contradictory. You know, we mentioned the new mandatory waiver process, and we need to figure out ways where kids can be addressed individually. One of the things we have going for us now is judges are able to use their discretion to determine when kids should be transferred. I think that discretion needs to be reviewed again, not only going up, but maybe coming back down. We don't have a reverse waiver provision because information later on can come out and the state may decide, you know what, maybe this should have been in juvenile court in the first place, so we have to address that as well.
Judge Trash?
Yeah, let me give you an example to sort of further explain what Eric's talking about. If a juvenile comes in and under the current provision, the district attorney's office and the court system has to make a very quick decision as to what to charge the juvenile with and whether or not there's probable cause for that case to move forward. What frequently happens is when district attorneys have limited information, they charge the highest level of offense possible. Well, because we have an automatic waiver provision for A through G felonies, many cases that would end up being pled down to a low-level felony or even a misdemeanor under the way the law is written now will stay in adult court. So a juvenile might be charged, steal a phone, you know, I threaten to hit you and you give me your phone, you're charged with common law robbery. Right now that's an automatic transfer once a judge finds probable cause or there's an indictment, but there's no provision when the district attorneys look at the case and they're like, wait a minute, this is really more of a misdemeanor larceny case. This is not a Class G felony or a Class E felony or whatever they're charged with. Right now, even though the case would then be reduced to a misdemeanor larceny, it stays in the adult system. And I don't think that's what the framers of the legislation want. So I'm hopeful that they'll come up with a provision that a superior court judge or the district attorney's office can then send the case back to juvenile court if it's pled down to a lesser offense.
Absolutely. And in closing, what do you think what are the lessons that other states can learn from the challenges that you've seen trying to put this bill together or generally working on reform in juvenile justice?
Well, you know, for me it was a breeze. It was only 12 years of work. But I was talking to somebody recently in a state. So there's some states that still have the maximum age at 17. And I was talking to somebody from there, and you know, it is a marathon, and you have to think about this in stages and what's going to be, you know, an effective pitch. And again, I think there was so much information. You know, the Chief Justice's study was actually the 5th study that recommended raise the age since 2007. So, you know, once you say things 5 times, you know, maybe it'll come through. And sometimes you just have to be patient and consistent and forthright about it.
Absolutely. Ricky?
I think those are words to live by even when you're handling and addressing kids too, right? Like sometimes it might take the 3rd, 4th, 5th time. I think that, yeah, I don't have kids, but that's what I hear. I feel like we really have an opportunity to keep the momentum going after Raise the Age. I think that we need to really make sure that we don't forget about those huge, large, racial and gender disparities that exist in the systems that we have and figure out how to address those first. Because I think we'll continue to have a lot of issues until we figure out how to address those problems. If you're black, if you're male, and if you have a disability, you're more likely to be involved in the juvenile system or the criminal system. And I think that those are big picture issues that we need to continue to remember and keep our eye on as we raise the age, because again, disparities have gotten worse as we've progressed over the last 10, 15 years. Yeah, maybe we have fewer youth in the system, but the disparities are getting worse. So we need to really figure out how to address the disparities, and I think then we'll really have some real solutions.
Judge Trash, and then we have a second for questions.
So to that, I think that the key is the length of time. You can't come to one forum one day and have everything change and everybody sing Kumbaya. Back in the year 2000, Community Building Initiative led the judges through a process called Judicial Leadership in a Diverse Community. We didn't know where that was going to go, but we are now 17 years later, and initiatives like Race Matters for Juvenile Justice or the Pathways Project or what's going on with the Safety and Justice Challenge have resulted from us sitting around tables, heads of agencies and institutions and community activists and community members, and talked about the problems in a real and honest way. And when you do that, you may not get the solution the first year or the second year, you probably won't. But after 10 or 15 years, you reach a tipping point. And I think this community has reached a tipping point. At least I hope that we've reached a tipping point to where we're going to continue to make progress. And not just talk about reduced overall numbers, but start talking about reduced disparities and disproportionalities. I may not get there with you, but I'm hoping that my kids and my grandkids will see that day.
Absolutely. We have a question.
Not really a question, but my name is Kenyatta Bigger with Communities in Schools. So this is near and dear to my heart, especially when we talk about the number of referrals that are coming from the school side. So one of the things that I'm seeing is that a lot of those kids are going undiagnosed. So mental health is what the issue is. One of the things that I've truly been preaching at my school is that if the school takes a better look at the amount of referrals that a kid receives and then puts a protocol in place where that child can be assessed, I think we can help you guys cut down on some of those numbers. So I'm glad that you guys have that task force. So please, sirs, take that to heart, because a lot of those kids walk around undiagnosed. Also, when we pulled the families, the information that we got back was so overwhelming about the needs that the families really had for a lot of the kids. But then you'll look at the infrastructure in the school, and the school doesn't have the capacity, just like the jail doesn't have the capacity to address the mental health needs of the kids that we serve.
All I can say to that is amen.
So one brief response, I just heard last Friday, the kids who are in our youth development centers, our youth prisons, there's about 185, 190 at any given time. Every single one of them was identified with a mental health need. Every single one recently.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon. My name is Bishop Tanya Rawls, and I'm Executive Director of the Freedom Center for Social Justice. I want to make a note to something that happened in the last session first, and that was when a young person asked a question that someone was uncomfortable with, and then it was stated that the question was silly. So when and people applauded. So what was interesting was, before even making the statement, I was asked, is it okay or should I say who I'm with before I make my statement? When we ever get to the place where questions that young people ask, and when we're in organizations that young people will be coming forward, if we're really serious about making some of these changes, we also have to be okay with how they say what they say. And I think until we do that, this is all BS, right? So now, that being said, I wanted to say it to him, but he left too soon. So, my question is in reference to LGBTQ young people. When we talk about discrepancies and disparities, the numbers that you have for Black students, you'd have to up that for LGBTQ students. And it was interesting that I didn't hear that population mentioned, and was curious about how you see that playing out in the system, and what kind of things we can do to help improve their experiences.
So I'll start to answer your question. I appreciate it as well, because it's actually a part of the report that we've got coming out at Youth Justice Project. The big problem with LGBTQ students is that those types of statistics and metrics aren't really tracked or kept. So it's really hard to account for exactly how those students are kind of navigating throughout the school system. So I would say a big solution would be to figure out how to track or monitor in some way people that identify that way.
Yeah, and I would say not just for LGBT students, but also across the board, we don't keep, for Hispanic or Latino students, for example, every agency keeps different statistics. So I think across the board, the first thing you have to do in order to reach a resolution or to a better place, get to a better place, is to know what your numbers are and know what things look like. And we just don't do a good job of that right now. So I would agree wholeheartedly with that.
Absolutely. We have our last question. Oh, last question this way.
What are we doing to disrupt the pipeline in the education or preparation of the teachers, which seems to be where the criminal action is happening, ill-prepared individuals working in the educational system that can handle it, so they pass it along. So maybe at the state level, at the university level, is there any conversation happening there from your area with those agencies?
So our school system, I can speak locally to our school system. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools has been a partner with us with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. So they have sent most of their leadership staff and many of their area superintendents and principals to a 2-day workshop called the Race Equity Workshop. You may have known that as a Dismantling Racism Workshop, which talks about a lot of these issues and their response to students and their own biases that they may not be aware of. So in addition to that, they also partnered with a group called the Winter Group to begin to do exactly some of the things that you talked about, to better prepare teachers, to change the way that they approach discipline in school by school and area by area within the system. So I know that they are engaged in a lot of efforts, but it's a long road, and there are a lot of teachers, and it's a long journey, I think, to get to a place where every teacher approaches things from a strength-based perspective as opposed to a get them out of my classroom because you're causing trouble perspective. But we're on that road, and CMS has been a partner. I also know that at UNCC and some of the other local institutions, they're bringing lessons to their students who are going to be teachers and social workers about things like implicit bias, which frankly just used to not happen. So they didn't get any training about their own biases or about institutional racism or those types of things at all. And now I think they're getting more training about that. So there's hope for the future.
I think the answer to your question is probably as diverse and varied as there are public school or educational systems across the state. I think that some are doing a really good job at trying to educate their teachers and get them on the right track, but I think that some probably it's not even on their radar. But what I do know is that teachers need resources to do that. And if you have a legislator that's constantly and consistently gutting and taking away resources to really, help teachers to be able to do what they need to do, it's going to be a lot harder to address. So I think we need to start by making sure that teachers have the resources that they need to be able to do what they need to do.
Absolutely. We're going to take one final.
My name is Kendra King, and I'm the Advanced Advocate and Accountability Specialist with Market Your Mind Services. I'm also an advocate and mentor at the only alternative school in Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, Turning Point Academy. My question is, what is y'all's thoughts or plan to address the school-to-prison pipeline that exists there? Because for the past 2.5 years, I've been doing an assessment on this particular school. There's a lack of resources in regards to mental health, in regards to security, in regards to effective staff, whether it be teachers, administration. There's students there that have charges from rape to murder to aggravated assault. One of my girls that was exploited, trafficked, and murdered while in DSS custody, and it happened on a school day. What else are y'all gonna do to prevent the commercial sexual exploitation and domestic minor sex trafficking that happens to girls of color here in Mecklenburg County? Because it just seems that there's a bigger focus on African American males and there's a neglect on these girls. So that is my question for this particular panel.
It's a big question, and there's a lot of things that are going on. We do have a community-wide task force that's looking at human trafficking and what can be done. Our former U.S. Attorney, Ann Tompkins, was instrumental in getting that rolling. And so there are a lot of things that are being done in juvenile court. One of the things that we have done is, frankly, we didn't have protocols for young women or young men, because both young women and young men are unfortunately involved in human trafficking. We didn't have any protocols. So we didn't know how to identify. It was sort of under the radar. Nobody talked about it. You just didn't think about it. And so some bad things happened. You mentioned one bad thing that happened, but other bad things were happening where in the adult system, young women were being bonded out by their uncles, and we found out they weren't their uncles. And so we've now developed a protocol for not just the court system, but for social workers, for probation officers, for juvenile court counselors to recognize signs that the young person might be involved in human trafficking, and then a protocol to deal with what do you do. And that's at the beginning stages that we really should be farther along, but we're moving in that direction. We've got a lot of work to do in a lot of these areas. We simply do.
Thank you for that really important question, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
For a conversation on creating a more equitable Charlotte, please welcome Oliver Marino, an activist and community advocate at the Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy. Brenda Tyndall, a historian at the Levine Museum of the New South. Lee Cochran, a senior vice president at real estate developer Laurel Street. James Ford, a co-chair of Leading on Opportunity. And leading the conversation, The Atlantic's Ron Brownstein.
If you look at the top line numbers, kind of the above the line, as they say in LA where I live, numbers, Charlotte has a lot of positives that it can tell about its economic story. Mecklenburg County has added 100,000 people from 2010 to 2015. You've had job growth of 16%, which puts you in the top 15 metros. You've had a significant increase in the GDP of the metro area, and even wages have gone up. I think it ranks 10th of the 100 largest metros. But the question which we discussed earlier today was, to what extent is any of that growth relevant to a kid growing up in one of the community's low-income neighborhoods? To what extent has Charlotte been able to find ways to connect its own low-income and minority communities to the growth it is experiencing? James?
I think it depends on who that kid is, what that kid looks like, where that kid lives, what income bracket that child comes from. I think those are largely the determinants. And whether or not the city has done enough, I think the answer, is affirmatively no.
Mm-hmm.
When you rank dead last in the country, as everybody knows in Charlotte, they hate this number,
Yeah.
dead last in economic mobility out of the 50 largest cities and 99th in terms of the county. I think there's obviously something wrong there, and it's undeniable that race absolutely colors, sorry for the pun, but determines so much of what that child's opportunities are. And obviously income is a part of that, but race and income are very connected and very strongly correlated. So I would say the answer is depends on who that kid is.
Oliver?
Well, I feel like this is like living in Charlotte. Like it's growing so much, but also it's leaving a lot of people behind. It feels like a golden cage almost. Like there's jobs, but the jobs that are here, like it's hard to survive on minimum wage. It's even hard to survive on 10 hours or $10 an hour. For like you have to have another second job to do that. And for the community that I'm part of and I work with, if you're undocumented, like there's like extra burdens that you have to suffer. And I think sometimes we fail to recognize that, and that there's people here in our community that are, despite all the difficulties that they have, they're thriving, but there's still so much that we can do for them.
Brenda, when John Hickenlooper is now the governor of Colorado, but before that he was the mayor of Denver, And he used to talk about something he called the Denver paradox. And he said, basically, we have a community and an economy that attracts smart young people from all over the country and all over the world to come here for the opportunities that we're creating. But we can't put our own kids on a track to compete for the jobs that we're building around us. To what extent does that verdict apply to Charlotte as well?
I think it absolutely applies. When we think about some of the statistics, the data that has really been part of the national discourse more recently, Charlotte ranks 50 of 50 in intergenerational socioeconomic mobility. Charlotte ranked 99th out of 100, or Mecklenburg County ranked 99 out of 100 in income equality. When we talk about the folks who are at the lowest quintile, those are native Charlotteans. That study looked at a cohort of young people and now adults who came up in the 1980s. Most of those folks have been here all of their lives. And so when we talk about the superlatives and the pull factors, Charlotte invites roughly about 50 people a day to the city. Most of which are being drawn to our banking industry and the incredible array of schools that we have. But what about the native Charlotteans? I think that's one of the critical questions we have to ask if we really want to talk about mobility in Charlotte.
Come back to that 1 second. Lee, we could walk out from here, and as we were saying before, you will walk in a few blocks in any directions and see things that were not there 15 or 20 years ago. And so there's a lot of new building, there's a lot of new development, there's a lot of new tax base, but there are also pressures on housing costs and competition for communities and access. For those native Charlotteans? Charlotteans. That was good. I'd not heard that before. Charlotte, for someone who's here, is this development a positive? How is this development improving their lives in any material way, or is it in some ways making it harder?
It's definitely making it harder. I think the biggest stress we're seeing is because downtown has become so popular, a lot of the older inner ring neighborhoods where a lot of those original Charlotteans have lived for 60, 70 years. So we work in neighborhoods and build housing in neighborhoods where folks have lived all their lives. And they're finally getting to a point where other people want to come and live in those neighborhoods, and they're seeing gentrification pressures. So the opportunity is, if we build enough housing and we allow them to stay in those neighborhoods, they can benefit from all of that new growth, from the new tax base, and from the new services that'll come with that investment. But if they just get displaced, then what really have they benefited?
What's the right goal? Is the goal to prevent new people from coming in, or is it to basically integrate them with the people who are already there and avoid them being moved out?
Our goal in housing, my goal has always been, and I think it helps with a lot of the problems, whether it's education or economic opportunity, is if we can integrate neighborhoods, we solve a lot of problems. But that goes two ways. You can take middle and higher income neighborhoods and build new affordable housing in those neighborhoods that integrates it one way. Or you can also, at the same time, have neighborhoods that are seeing folks wanting to live there. You want to invite those folks in. You want those folks to come in because that integrates your neighborhood as long as you allow the folks that are there to stay. So I don't think we want to say, please don't come, please don't come. We want people to invest, but we want to just make sure that the existing residents benefit from that.
Do you agree with that?
Somewhat. On the one hand, I think that integration is important, but not integration for the sake of integration. I think it's important to recognize and appreciate the value and the agency of the folks who already live there, that they are deserving of those opportunities, whether or not they live in proximity to somebody else who is more prosperous or not. So ultimately, I think the overall goal would be to create a more just, a more equitable, a more humane community, one that is compassionate and one that doesn't allow your demographics to determine your destiny. As she mentioned, folks from Charlotte, and I'm not a Charlatan. I'm a
learn
transplant.
how to pronounce it. That's good.
That's job one. You can't say charlatan, so you got to figure out what the actual term is. Not charlatan, it's charlatan. But you know, I have been one of those individuals who's been blessed. For me, coming from a Rust Belt city in northern Illinois, this was my promised land. But what I had to recognize was the greater landscape was that people have been here for generations, and they didn't need a researcher or a study group or any of that to tell them that they were locked out.
right? And so what we need now is we need to figure out how do we shape the systems and the structures to make sure that whether or not affordable housing is available, which it absolutely has to be, but wherever I live, I'm not locked out from the opportunities that are present.
Talk about locked out. Can we call up the first slide? I hope. We'll see if we can. So the National Equity Atlas, which is a group called PolicyLink out of the Bay Area that many of you may know, studies demographic and economic trends in the major cities in America. And if you look at this, it's pretty incredible. This is the average hourly, the median hourly wage in inflation-adjusted dollars for whites and people of color in the Charlotte metro area. And you can see that despite all of the growth in this community, the gap is actually bigger than it was when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, right? So the gap is actually wider today than it was 35 years ago. With all the jobs, all the growth, everything that's happened, Brenda, how do we end up in that situation? And we could add that the poverty rate is about 1 in 9 among white families, about 1 in 4 for people of color, both African Americans and Latinos. How do we end up with these disparities persisting despite a generation of really transformative growth?
I think that we have to remind ourselves that the definitions of, for instance, affordable housing have also changed since the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
We've often defined or conflated affordable housing with low income. That simply isn't the case. I know too many professors, too many teachers, folks that would have in the 1980s qualified as middle class who can't find housing. And if you think about Also, if you think about some of the data that is available, for instance, on the Charlotte Housing Authority website, you'll note that roughly 30,000 Charlotteans are waiting to find Section 8 vouchers. 30,000. So we can't underestimate the social and economic challenges that people in our city are having in spite of sort of this reputation of being a opportunity-rich community.
Yeah.
And also I think if our purview is Center City, we have a very short-sighted sense of the vast reality that exists beyond the contours of Center City. And we have to figure out how to understand our city beyond just simply what's happening here.
Oliver, can I ask you, Charlotte is like a lot of cities east of the Mississippi where the historical dynamic and the tensions and the struggles and the friction were basically binary. It was white and black. That's right. But now you have new elements, significant new elements. From 2000 to 2010, the Latino population increased 153%. The Asian American population doubled in the Charlotte metro. The black population increased 40%, white population 17%. You have these new communities that have emerged. How does that change the dynamic? How does that change the discussion? And do you feel as though those communities are being heard amid the continuing dialogue about white and African American relations?
Well, I think sometimes when we discuss affordable housing or when we discuss education or policing, like the Latino community is like an afterthought. The conversations are often black and white, even though we have about 12% Latino here in Charlotte. And when we talk about how do we make sure that people are able to live in this city, we fail to recognize that we have a sizable community that is undocumented. And how do we make sure that they're also part of Charlotte? They're Charlotteans, but we see them as foreigners, we see them as different. And when we start to do that, you begin to justify the type of conditions that they're living in or the type of oppressions that they're under. And so, part of my responsibility, just as a community member, is to advocate not only for myself and for my family, but for the people that I know that are just as deserving to live in a city whenever they work, they're able to pay their housing, that their kids are able to go to a school and have a good education. And honestly, I think this city has failed to recognize that population, and it's still sometimes very hard to make either the police force or the city council, the county commissioners, to understand that even though some people cannot vote because of the immigration status, that they have a responsibility to make their lives better in this place.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add on to that, a lot of the discussions that we were just having about displacement in neighborhoods are still very binary, black and white. It's a traditional African-American neighborhood with higher income, mostly whites coming in and integrating those neighborhoods and displacing. And Latino have been left out of that conversation. It just hasn't been part of that conversation. But I think what the trend we're seeing in the last couple of years now is more displacement has happened, and that happens house by house. The displacement we're now seeing is community by community, where entire 300-unit apartment complexes are being torn down to build new housing. And that, I think, in replacing family housing with housing for singles. And that's a fairly new conversation in Charlotte, maybe the last year or two. And that has huge effects on kind of all populations, because I think that affects everyone. So I think you're going to see that conversation become more prominent in the months, kind of the years to come.
And just to kind of give you an example, we have local elections happening at the moment, and including the school board, and there was a panel discussion, and one of a reporter from a local Spanish newspaper asked the people that were running for school board, do you know how many Latino students are in your district? And none of them could answer that question, right? I wonder if the people that are running for city council know how many Latinos are in their district or in the city of Charlotte or Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Like, that's how oblivious they are. And when you don't even recognize that people are there, you don't recognize what they need.
What is the number in the K-12 system? What is it, 30%?
So it's about 3 out of 5 students in Charlotte, in CMS. Maybe, James, you have a better number. But
we're a vastly majority minority school district.
Right. Exactly. And we don't have any type of representation, whether it's in the school board, in city council, county commissioners, and like that support is not there. And when people voice it, it's like, why? Like, there's not a willingness to engage even in this conversation.
And if I could just tell really quickly, I think we need to be transparent, and I think even for a lot of black folks, that's a blind spot. Because we've been so entrenched, and I do, in the bookends of the racial hierarchy and all those battles, I think we oftentimes forget that when we talk about people of color, that when you look at most of those categories, Latino folk are right down there with black folk. I mean, the group with the highest rate of poverty in Mecklenburg is Latinx people. Absolutely.
So, as the quote from John Hickenlooper kind of suggested, Charlotte is not the only city dealing with this question of, even amid fast growth, how do you expand opportunity to all the communities in your area? I mean, it's true in Seattle, it's true in Austin, it's true in Denver, even San Jose. Places that are doing the best are grappling with these issues of concentrated poverty, segregation, high concentrations of poverty in the schools. One thing, though, that makes Charlotte somewhat unusual is that you have tried to at least examine these, and we heard these earlier, kind of talking, not doing maybe, but you've tried to examine these more systematically, and you served on a task force that looked directly at this issue of opportunity and upward mobility, inspired by the Raj Chetty results, came out with your report this spring. You identified several areas out of all the different possibilities. Obviously, there are a lot of different places. You picked 3 policy areas and 2 kind of more cross-cutting as the levers that you thought were the most important. Can you explain what they were and why you chose those? Why you think those are the place where you can make the biggest dent?
Sure. So one qualification is I didn't actually serve on the task force, so I don't want to take credit for them, but I do fully endorse the work that they did in the report. I think the reason that they chose those 5 areas, so being cross-cutting factors, segregation/racialization, social capital, early care and education, college and career access, and then family stability, is because even when you look at the Chetty study, some of those are the very same correlates, the determining factors there. And then there are some very contextual things about Charlotte's history that are acknowledged and that document and how we got here. And so when you chunk those things out, that's why I think, when we talk about the 3 determinants, I also want to say those are flanked between cross-cutting factors, things that are seeped into everything. So
segregation and social capital.
Yeah, you can't tease those apart from all the various other things. But when you look at trying to create a generational shift and a change in the structures, every system, and this is David Stroh's quote, but every system is designed to achieve whatever it's accomplishing, right? So the question is whether that's intentional or not. Which gets into some more debate. But we have to look at the systems, and when you look at what a system is, taking a child from really prenatal all the way through to high school, to career, and then eventually to prosperity, you have to look at it as kind of where do we on-ramp or off-ramp kids to give them the best opportunity for success. So that's how they came up with those factors.
And I want to zero in on one for a moment, early childhood, and maybe bring in everybody on this, because the report talks about the value of universal pre-K for
Right.
4-year-olds. Is there any momentum, life, interest in driving that forward in the community? What would it take for that to happen?
So what's interesting is you may know that the county just released a report kind of charting a pathway toward achieving potentially universal pre-K sponsored by the CELC. And what they found is from their polling data is that, and this is astounding, in Charlotte and Mecklenburg, 70%, well, 90-some% are in favor of pre-K and see the value and utility. 70% said they'd be willing to raise their taxes by $10 a month. Check this out. 71% said they'd be willing to raise their taxes by $20 a month. So when you ask about momentum, clearly there's something there. People see the value in that. And this is the part about Charlotte and Mecklenburg that often gets overlooked. Do I think that everybody has an equity mindset and everybody wants everybody to prosper? Absolutely not. You can't say that about anywhere. I think there's enough people here, though. I think there's enough people here who care, who want to live in a beloved community, who don't want to otherize other folks, who think that prosperity is not a pie, right? Where if you get more, that means I get less. So I think there's momentum around that potentially if something like that can be endorsed and be voted on by county commissioners.
Brenda, you're an historian. I'm interested, traditionally, historically, looking at Charlotte, you had the unrest, the uprising last fall. What has been the reaction in the past to that kind of emergence? Is it a circling the wagons, or does it get a response? You know, which way does the city go?
Well, I think it's really important to also note that the protests actually took place in Center City, which is technically the economic hub of our city. And oftentimes when we talk about urban unrest, it often takes place in sort of African American or communities of color. I absolutely think that the protests taking place right here in Center City made it a real priority. It made it a significant priority. It put it on, it became part of the DNA of our dialogue. And so I think that's important to note. What I also think is important to note is the folks that were participating in the protests. It was not a sort of police against Black people. It was one of the most diverse groups of people that I have seen in this city come together over issues that they believe are a shared responsibility. And so I think it's important to note that. I also think it's important to note that it became a platform for talking about other issues, not just simply officer-involved shootings, but also housing, also schools, also a whole host of issues that can't be ignored when we talk about social and economic mobility challenges in our city.
I want to follow up on that, but Oliver, you wanted to get in.
Yeah, I think one of the important things to understand is that when the uprising happened, and I, like many other people, were out there, like the people that were in the streets, that were not talking about affordable housing or education, right, or higher pay. They were talking about police shooting people and not being accountable. And that hasn't changed. Like, we had Ruben Galindo, who was killed by CMPD with his hands up. Like, that video is out there, and that's something to recognize, right? Later on, one of the changes that happened is that people started, pulling out their wallets and say, this is, people that had the money, of course, say this is a problem, right? And we saw a lot of donations to organizations that, were doing work. But honestly, a year out, we haven't seen that type of change, that noticeable change. And another thing is that we've had task force before. We had an immigration task force that came out with outline a series of recommendations, and the city really hasn't done much until recently. They're trying to hire one person, when the recommendations call for an office of New Charlotteans that would address education, economic mobility, and these things. Those recommendations kind of have gone out the way, and now we have a new task force, right? New recommendations, and so I hope that they put some intent behind that, but I'll wait and see what happens, because I guess this happened before and nothing's changed.
Yeah, Lee, did you want to? No. Oh, okay. So let me ask this then. I'll ask you a question, because the Opportunity Task Force, as James noted, put a lot of weight on segregation as a root of many of the inequities and disparities in the community. Segregation stands apart as a cross-cutting factor because it is foundational to everything else. Not only are we segregated by race and ethnicity, we are also segregated by wealth and poverty. Are there opportunities to break that down, particularly in a community that's growing, or is that just a foundational fact of life in Charlotte?
I think growth presents an opportunity because one of the things that I learned as I was growing up and going through grad school is that surprised me is southern cities tend to be, on average, less segregated than northern cities. And a lot of that is because of growth. So the most integrated neighborhoods in Charlotte and in most places tend to be new neighborhoods because they have a fresh start. You build brand new housing, everybody moving there, it's kind of a blank slate. Now they tend not to be very income integrated, but they kind of racially integrated. They're more so than kind of our neighborhoods that have just kind of always been the way they are. So what growth allows you is to kind of mix up the pot. Because if no one's moving to your city, if there's no new jobs, everything kind of stagnates. Everything just kind of stays the way it's always been, which is not where we want it to be. So growth presents opportunities, but you actually have to be intentional. You can't just let it kind of do what it's going to do, because what happens is the older neighborhoods are going to just stay the way they are unless you intentionally try to build new housing or stir the pot.
Also, alongside being intentional, I think you also have to think about it in an intersectional way as well. So when we think about what happened in terms of school desegregation, right? We also need to think about what it means to change the landscape of our housing, right? And one of the ways in which we experimented with that in the 1970s was through scattered site housing, which is to integrate low-income families into middle-income neighborhoods. The problem with that is when we actually reverted to, when we did away with busing as a mechanism for desegregating public schools in '99 with the Potter decision, as soon as we did that, roughly 4 years later, what we realized is that we had not developed a sustained program for more integrated neighborhoods, which meant that we reverted back to resegregated
very high
schools.
levels. And so let me ask you, because in the same way that you went through this opportunity task force in a more visible, intentional way than many communities, you also went through a school assignment debate that was more visible and intentional than many other communities. And the school board came out with recommendations in May, I believe it was, or a plan in May of this year. The schools are having to deal with the reality of a segregated housing market. How effective is what the schools came up with, in your mind, in creating a more economically and racially integrated
Me
experience?
Personally?
Yeah. You personally.
Speaking for James E. Ford and James E. Ford only, I was underwhelmed by it. I was underwhelmed by it. I thought that contextually, in a 2-year span, you had, Charlotte, and I was pretty vocal. I'm an educator. Charlotte being outed for running a segregated school district when it once kind of taught the rest of the nation, right, how to desegregate. Not that all was well, but Charlotte had a prominent position. Then you also had headlines once we found out we were dead last in economic mobility. And then you had civil unrest take place in a 24-month period, and that was not enough to create the public will for us to take bold steps to rapidly help to desegregate and break up concentrations of poverty. Now, the task force report didn't weigh in what particular action, but we did say this is something that needs to be attended to. And that sends ripple effects because we know that school assignment and housing policy are inextricably linked. There's plenty of research around that. And so I think it puts the rest of us in a tougher position in terms of reshaping the opportunity structure. However, it doesn't excuse us from, especially other sectors, housing, et cetera, from continuing to take up bold steps and pick up where they left off. There's much more work to be done. You could argue some positive steps, but it didn't have the impact. It wasn't bold what I expected.
Oliver, what was your take on it? What does it mean for your community, the communities where you work?
I think there might be other better people to answer this question than me.
Okay.
So,
Brenda?
I have no comments on that.
I'm still thinking about it.
The challenge with all of these, I think, is politicians are naturally conservative, not politically conservative, are naturally cautious. To your point, data like everyone will do $20 a month, 70% will help them because like, oh wait, I'm allowed to vote for this, because they're not going to vote for a tax increase without a lot of data that says I'm not going to get voted out of office. And schools was similar. I think the fear that if you're too bold on the school assignment plan that essentially half the kids will just leave the school system. You know, that you'll end up worse off than you were before. It naturally creates caution. And so how we kind of push them to be a little bit more bold, I think is hard, because that's what they're balancing.
In fairness to the schools, in any community, they are being asked to overcome a lot of other factors that are out there. When you're dealing with today, I think in Charlotte, 3/4 of African American and almost 4/5 of Latino kids are in schools where a majority of their classmates qualify as poor or low income, compared to only about 1/4 of white. So you have a stark racial differential in the concentration of poverty. Call up the second slide if we could. And that really goes to this question about whether you can equalize opportunity for kids without creating more equal opportunity for adults. So look at this. This is an interesting, there's a lot of numbers up there, but it basically tells you that if you look at the Charlotte metro area, the estimate is that about 42% of the jobs by 2020 will require some kind of post-secondary degree. 51% of whites, a very high number of US-born whites in the Charlotte metro have a college degree. When you look at US-born African Americans, it's 33%, Latino immigrants, 13%. So I guess my question is it right to focus only on expanding opportunity for kids, or can you realistically do that without equalizing more opportunity for the adults in their lives?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think kids are a good focal point, but at the end of the day, I mean, they live in a household. They have to be fed today. Some kid at school needs to go home and be able to have a meal. They should be able to. And then when you look at the Chetty study, it talks about young families primarily. And really, the impact is most felt when those young families are able to move the child into a high opportunity neighborhood by the age 10. After 10 years old, there's a diminishing effect there, right? So, but it starts with that family unit and being able to offer opportunities, a livable wage for the folks who are probably in the service sector, who may not be in the mid-skill or high-skill range, but are certainly deserving of being able to provide for themselves, certainly deserving of having affordable housing. They have children. And so I think you can't separate the two or bifurcate them. You have to be able to concentrate on kids, but the way of doing that is by starting with families.
In the communities where you work, do adults see a way, do they see a ladder? Do they see a way to move up economically, either through training or to find better paying jobs, or is there largely a feeling of being stuck in place?
So I don't speak for a whole community, but I would say, you know, not everybody in this community is undocumented. Some of them are. But we do see, what I see is there's some mixed status families. Sometimes the kids are US born and then the parents are not. And that complicates things because they don't have access to those opportunities, like even training or these systems that are supposed to help people but because they have a different immigration status, they don't have access to them. And you know, one of the things that as a community, I think what we've been trying to do is to make sure that those parents feel safe in this city, because it's hard to provide for your kids when you're not in this country. And so that, you know, we've had earlier this year we had ICE raids in the city, and there was really a lack of response from the community. Because they happen in immigrant centers, like in the east side, and there really hasn't been that type of like solidarity from the other parts of the community. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does, absolutely. Let's go to the audience for a couple questions. We have microphones. If we have one down here and one back there. Yeah, so we'll get this one next. Down here, next. Just hold on, we got someone back there.
Yeah, my name is Brandon Lazarus, and I'm a pastor at Memorial United Methodist. There's a member of our community who is undocumented. He had a heart attack. His heart stopped for 2.5 minutes before he was brought back. He now can't work for 6 months, and because he's undocumented, does not have disability, does not have access to food stamps, does not have any of those resources. So Oliver, if you could speak a little bit to our undocumented brothers and sisters and the added economic disadvantage of not having access to certain resources.
Yeah, so I would say, like, right now I'm very fortunate to have a job where I get healthcare, but I did not see a doctor for like 10 years or like a dentist for like 10 years because it's an economic burden. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, that's something that you just can't do, right? Either you eat or you go to the doctor. And like my family, like they're still facing those things. Like there's some low income clinics, but some of them don't provide for service to undocumented folks. Some of them do, some of them don't. One of the things, the interesting things that people don't really even think about, that there's, we call it, I don't know if there's Spanish speaking folks here, but El Salvador. These are like folks that are, you go and like, if you have an ache, you go to this person and they like, I don't know what they do, like massage you and like do things that are like they don't have actual like formal educational training, but they are service providers for the community, coming from the community. And that's a burden that like for a lot of people, you wait until it's an emergency and you go to the emergency care, and people say that's a burden, but they're paying taxes, so they should have access to that too.
Question over here.
Thank you. Aya Sudama, founder of Charlotte Bush Vihara Monastery and president of Shamrock Hills Neighborhood Association. I'm really in touch with some of my poorest neighbors, aware of the one, for example, who can't pay his electric bill, so he lives in a house that technically worthy of being condemned, therefore he can't get certain repairs done and so on. And another neighbor is telling me about the food banks cutting back. Now you have to have not gone to this or that food bank within 90 days. So there are long gaps between ability of times to get to food banks. My question for you is, who is tracking the nickeling and diming of the poorest of the poor, such as the raising of the cost of the 10-ride bus pass, which is the ticket for the poorest of the poor? That was a city council decision made after that study found us dead last. And another decision to cause the apartment buildings to have to pay for the removal of trash. Yes, that affected some very wealthy apartments, but also the poorest of the poor. And we're about to get, I don't see any big momentum to stop this, Duke Power from raising the base rate, not the rate. You can turn off your lights all you want, but you still gotta pay that basic cost. And again, your house is condemned if you don't do it, and you can't live you can't rent the house, you can't live, it's like, this is a matter of being homed or homeless, that Duke Power thing. Who's working on this? Who's bringing this to the attention of our elected officials? Thank you.
Do you want to, James or Brenda, do you want to start?
I think what you just suggested is a clarion call for ensuring that the people at the table aren't just, it's not a top-down conversation. That we understand the grievances across that difference. And I think it's time for us to be sure that when we have these kinds of forums, that it includes the voices and perspectives of our most vulnerable citizens, frankly. And so I think, I don't know who's doing all of the data collection, but I think what you've suggested is that there is a clarion call to be sure that these conversations are more well-rounded and that the policies and decisions that we make as a community reflect that. We have to go from asking the question or saying that Charlotte is a place that has a lot. We have to start asking the question, for who?
Yeah. Before you jump in, James, I want to put one more spin on that question. And maybe it's almost as a closing note, because we're near that point. I've been struck all day in listening to all these conversations and in the conversation we had last night in advance of this, that in talking about all these issues of equity, there's elections and elected officials seem very far away from the, I mean, you're electing a mayor in a few weeks in this city after a very dramatic primary where you ousted your current mayor. To what extent are the kinds of questions we're talking about equity here, in economic opportunity, in the schools, in the criminal justice system, to what extent are they part of the political debate here? To what extent do you look to political leaders for answers and leadership on this? And to what extent is it really kind of community leaders trying to find solutions among themselves because they don't have a lot of faith that the political system will respond?
I think it's largely political. And I would categorize everything we're talking about in three different ways. I call them personally the 3 Ps. I think that the change we're talking about starts with people. I believe in democracy in the sense that naturally the people are the ones who have the power, right? So it's people who are going to make the change. It's not a council. of people. It's not people who are heads of institutions. At the end of the day, the people are the ones who hold the power. The second P is programs. I think there's lots of opportunity out here, folks who are doing good work who we don't even know about. Yes. We know about the bigger ones, those who are funded, those who have budgets, but there's folks in neighborhoods doing really good work who we don't get to see, who need to be elevated and need to have their capacity expanded. A lot of community organizing, et cetera. They got to be at the table. And lastly is policies. We're not a political organization in the sense that we're partisan, but whenever you talk about policies, you're going to have to deal with politics. And it takes electing individuals who express a willingness to create the sort of policies and the policy environment that helps to get those things done. And the people make that decision ultimately.
Thank you. Lee, you have a relevant, I mean, obviously the private sector can do a lot on housing, but ultimately can it do it without public policy that pushes in the right direction?
We don't really do anything, on virtually no project we do we not do without some sort of public funding. So, and Charlotte has stepped up over many years, 10 to 15 years on funding affordable housing, but I think we need to give them political cover to do more. There is a big debate that's happening, not yet publicly, of when we go every 2 years to do a new bond referendum for affordable housing, that amount is probably going to go up, but how much more will it go up? And essentially, if you get to a certain point where that starts to affect tax rate, people have to give politicians cover to do that, because they're not going to go raise taxes unless they feel like they can do it and not just get thrown out in the next election. We have elections every 2 years, so it can be very quick. So we have to give them that cover.
Brenda, all our thoughts on this?
I think equity has to have purchase in this community, sustainable purchase. In other words, I don't think that we should mobilize around the concept of equity only when we're having an intergenerational social and economic mobility conundrum, that it has to be part of the Charlotte way. We have to redefine what that means, both rhetorically, but what that means in practice, day in, day out. So this is not something that should be short-term. I think it needs to be part of our long-term approach to community building.
Oliver,
I think, you know, I've stopped believing in politicians and started believing in the power that people have to make change. And there's a lot of money here in this city. I think what we need is courage, because that I haven't seen. And one of the things we haven't touched on is how HB2 has changed the outlook of our local elected officials, who take that as an excuse to not be more forward-thinking and more progressive. And so I think we have to keep them accountable. And you know, they have their job, but they are accountable to community. And so I think the community also has a job to play.
Well, this has been a great panel. Will you join me in thanking them? And I think we have some final words from, actually, we can sit for Margaret.
Thank you, Brenda, Oliver, James, Lee, and Ron, and thanks to all of our speakers and moderators who've been with us here today. My special thanks and appreciation to the MacArthur Foundation, to Bank of America, and to the Annie E. Casey Foundation for making today possible. I think it's fair to say that this has been a rich and occasionally a raw conversation. We heard from a public defender who said he worked in the criminal court system. He said it hadn't earned the title criminal justice system, not yet. We heard that we live in a throwaway society, about the need to see everyone's essential humanity, and we heard about the power of hope and the lack of it. Housing, education, segregation, police reform, juvenile justice reform. These aren't new issues we grappled with today, but we helped amplify the stories and the voices of the people working to find solutions to these vexing problems. Perhaps we're at a tipping point, one local judge suggested earlier. I just want to note that before the day began, I was actually sneaking out to grab a Starbucks, and I ran into somebody else who was going over there to grab a latte, and she was a lieutenant in the local police force, and I asked her why she came. And she said, look, Charlotte has some very, very real issues that we're grappling with. And she said, I came to listen and I came to learn. Lieutenant Ratliff, I hope you did. I hope everybody here did. We thank you so much for coming today. We know how precious your time is. Thank you for spending so much of it with us. I'm going to ask you one last favor before you dash out, go back to work, grab lunch. You will get from me a survey in your email, and there's some copies available in the room. I would love you to fill them out, because hearing what you thought of today, what this experience meant to you, helps us in our work going forward. Thank you again to everybody here, to all of you. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.